I've never been quite sure about sharing this, but after keeping it to myself for so long, I feel like I need to tell someone. What I experienced that summer day in 1976 at Atwood Lake, Ohio, has stayed with me for all these years. I was just a few weeks shy of turning 13, and looking back now, I can still feel every detail of that encounter as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was early August, unusually cool for that time of year. My family had a small cabin near the lake where we'd spend most weekends during summer. I was going through this phase where I was obsessed with insects, had this little collection going and everything. My parents thought it was weird, but they let me do my thing as long as I stayed within shouting distance of the cabin. That morning, I headed out around 10 a.m. with my collection jar and notebook. The air was damp from an overnight rain, and everything smelled fresh and earthy. I remember wearing my favorite red t-shirt and these old jeans with patches on the knees from all my crawling around looking for bugs. The forest floor was still wet, making my sneakers squelch with every step. I'd found this perfect spot about 200 yards from our cabin, just past where the tree line got thicker. There was this fallen log that was always crawling with the most interesting beetles. I'd been there maybe 45 minutes, completely absorbed in watching this beautiful iridescent beetle, when something changed. It's hard to explain, but suddenly everything felt different. The woods went quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet. This was like someone had hit a mute button. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Even the insects stopped buzzing. That's when I got this overwhelming feeling that something was watching me. You know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? It was like that, but 100 times stronger. I looked up slowly, and that's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a thick oak tree, was this being. I know how this sounds, but it was massive, had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The thing that struck me most was its fur dark brown, almost black, but with these lighter patches around what I guess was its shoulders. It wasn't matted or scraggly like you might expect. It looked almost glossy in the patches where the sunlight hit it. Its head was what really got me, though. It was kind of pointed at the top, not like a cone exactly, but definitely not round like a human head. And its eyes, I couldn't make out the color, but they were deep set under this heavy brow ridge. They looked intelligent. That's the only word I can think of to describe them. There was this smell, too, not overwhelming but distinct, like wet grass that had been sitting in a pile too long, mixed with something musty. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, just different, like nothing I'd ever smelled before or since. We just stood there staring at each other. I don't know how long, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. Time kind of stopped making sense. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. But here's the weird thing. I wasn't terrified. Don't get me wrong, I was scared, but not in the way you'd expect when facing something that could probably snap you like a twig. It was more like awe mixed with fear. Then I heard my mom calling for lunch in the distance. That broke whatever spell we were under. I dropped my collection jar. I can still hear the sound of it hitting that log, and I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, branches whipping past my face, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was certain if I did, it would be right behind me. But when I burst out of the trees near our cabin, panting and wild-eyed, there was nothing. No footsteps, no breaking branches, nothing following me. My mum took one look at me and asked if I'd seen a snake. I just nodded, grateful for the ready-made excuse for my panic. I never told my parents what happened. I was afraid they wouldn't let me go exploring anymore, and despite what I'd seen, I still loved those woods. But I never went back to that specific spot again. I'd take different routes, stay in clearer areas, always keeping my back to something solid. The weirdest part? Over the next few days, I noticed things around that area. Broken branches way too high up for any normal animal to reach. Some unusual prints in the mud near the lake, huge ones, but always partial, never clear enough to be sure. And that spot where I'd seen it? The log I'd been sitting on was moved about 10 feet from where it had been, and it was way too heavy for a kid to move. I'm 60 now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that day. I've read about other encounters, looked at photos and videos, but nothing quite matches what I saw. The creature I encountered wasn't the scary monster from horror stories. It seemed curious, maybe even as unsure about me as I was about it. The thing that stayed with me most isn't the fear or even the shock. It's the feeling that I witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, yet undeniably was. I've never seen anything like it again, but that one encounter was enough to convince me that there are things in our forests that we can't explain. Sometimes when I'm near wooded areas, I'll catch a whiff of that same musty, grassy smell, and my heart will skip a beat. But there's never been anything there, just memories of a summer day in 1976, when my whole understanding of what was possible changed forever. I still live in Ohio, though not near Atwood Lake anymore. I've gone back a few times over the years, but the area's different now, more developed, more people. Whatever I saw that day, if it's still out there, it's probably moved on to quieter places. But sometimes, especially on cool, damp mornings like that one, I wonder if somewhere in our forests, that creature is still there, watching and wondering about the strange little human it encountered all those years ago. I've never shared this story before, and honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that night in Sugar Creek. It was the summer of 1981, and I was 17. My best friend Mark's family owned a decent-sized farm about 20 miles outside of town, and we'd convinced our parents to let us camp out there for a night. Looking back, I wish we'd just stayed home. The day started normally enough. We drove out to the farm in Mark's beaten-up Ford pickup around 4 p.m. The weather was perfect for camping, clear skies, mild temperature, just a slight breeze. We picked a spot near Sugar Creek itself, about half a mile from the main farmhouse. The area was mostly open field with patches of dense forest surrounding it. The creek ran through a shallow valley, and we set up our tent on a small, elevated area that gave us a good view of the surroundings. I remember being excited about the whole thing. We'd brought basic camping supplies, a couple of sleeping bags, flashlights, some snacks, and Mark had his dad's old Coleman lantern. The plan was simple: hang out, maybe do some night fishing in the creek, and just enjoy being away from our parents for a night. The first few hours were exactly what you'd expect from two teenage guys camping. We set up the tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and spent time just talking about school, girls, and whatever else was on our minds. As the sun started setting, we got the fire going and broke out the hot dogs and marshmallows. Everything felt normal, safe. That changed around 11 p.m. We were sitting by the fire, and I was in the middle of telling Mark about this girl from school I liked, when the crickets just stopped. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second, the normal nighttime sounds of crickets and frogs from the creek. The next, absolute silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I remember looking at Mark and seeing him staring into the darkness beyond our campfire. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt wrong. Really wrong. The fire crackled, and somehow that simple, familiar sound made everything feel even more unsettling. Then we heard it. I've spent over 40 years trying to figure out how to describe that sound. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before or since. It started low, almost like a deep growl, but then it rose into something between a scream and a howl. The closest thing I can compare it to is maybe a wolf's howl, but wrong. Too deep, too long, and with this almost human quality that made my stomach turn. It seemed to come from the tree line about 200 yards from our camp, somewhere in the direction of the old Thompson property that bordered Mark's family's land. My whole body went cold. I turned to Mark and said, "What the hell was that?" He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his face pale in the firelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I didn't hear anything. But I knew he was lying. I could see it in his face, in the way his hands were shaking as he poked at the fire with a stick. He heard it. He just didn't want to admit it. The silence that followed was deafening. No crickets, no frogs, not even the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Just the crackling of our fire and our own breathing. We sat there, barely moving, both pretending we weren't terrified. Every snap of a twig in the darkness made us jump. Around midnight, we heard it again. This time it was closer, maybe 100 yards away. The sound was clearer now, and somehow even more terrifying. It had this resonance to it that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Mark dropped his stick and grabbed my arm. "We should go inside the tent," he said, still trying to maintain this facade that he hadn't heard the first howl. We quickly doused the fire and retreated to the tent. Looking back, it was probably the worst decision we could have made. Now we couldn't see anything beyond the weak beam of our flashlights. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound, no matter how small, felt like a threat. Neither of us slept. We sat in that tent, backs against each other, flashlights in hand, listening. The howls came 3 more times throughout the night. Each time they seemed to come from a different direction, like whatever was making them was circling our camp. The last one, just before dawn, couldn't have been more than 50 yards away. With it came this smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Mark finally cracked. "Do you smell that?" he whispered. I just nodded, afraid that speaking might somehow make things worse. Then we heard the footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate. The ground seemed to vibrate slightly with each one. They were moving parallel to our tent, just out of sight in the pre-dawn darkness. Whatever it was big, really big. We heard branches snapping under its weight, and this weird sound, like heavy breathing, but deeper than any human or animal I'd ever heard. It circled our tent twice. I remember sitting there, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, trying not to move, trying not to breathe. Just before sunrise, we heard one final howl, this time from much further away, back in the direction of the Thompson property. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went back to normal. The crickets started chirping again. Birds began their morning songs. It was like nothing had happened. When we finally worked up the courage to leave the tent, the morning sun was already up. The first thing I noticed was the silence around the farm. No distant tractor sounds, no cattle, no dogs barking, nothing. It felt empty, abandoned. The farm that had always been full of life and activity was like a ghost town. We packed up our stuff in record time, barely speaking. As we were loading the truck, I saw something that still haunts me. About 30 yards from where we'd camped, there was a series of impressions in the tall grass, like something huge had walked through it. The grass was bent and broken in a clear path, leading into the woods, and there, at the edge of the tree line, was a footprint. It was pressed deep into the soft earth, easily 16 inches long and incredibly wide. The imprint was clear enough that I could see what looked like toe marks. Mark saw me staring at it and practically dragged me to the truck. We didn't take pictures. We didn't investigate further. We just left. The drive back was silent. When we finally got back to town, Mark turned to me and said, "We don't talk about this, ever." I agreed, and for 43 years, I've kept that promise. Until now. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a bear, though we'd never had bears in that area. Maybe it was some kind of mass hysteria, though that doesn't explain the footprint. Maybe it was just 2 scared teenagers letting their imaginations run wild. But deep down, I know what I heard, what I smelled, what I felt. Mark's family sold the farm 2 years later. I never asked why, and he never offered an explanation. We gradually lost touch after high school, as people often do. The last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona and never returned to Sugar Creek. I've been back to the area a few times over the years, always during daylight. The farm's still there, though it's changed hands several times since then. The creek still runs through the valley, and the woods still stand dark and dense along the property line. But something about the place feels different now, like it's holding on to a secret. That night changed something in me. I still go camping occasionally, but never alone, and never without a solid structure nearby. And every time I hear an unexplained sound in the darkness, every time I catch an unusual scent on the wind, I'm right back there in that tent, 17 years old, listening to something impossible circling in the darkness. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I experienced that night in Sugar Creek, and whatever it was real, too real. Some nights, I still wake up hearing that howl, feeling the vibration of those footsteps, smelling that awful, distinctive odor. And I wonder if somewhere out there, in the woods around Sugar Creek, that thing is still walking, still howling, still hunting. I've been hesitant to share this for a long time, but what happened to me and my son back in September 2011 still haunts me. I live in a fairly remote part of Crawford County, Pennsylvania, about 15 miles outside of Meadville. My property sits on roughly 40 acres, mostly surrounded by cornfields with some wooded areas to the north. I've lived here for almost 30 years, and I thought I knew every sound, every animal, and every oddity that could occur on my land. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday night. I remember because I had just finished watching the evening news and was getting ready to head to bed around 10:30 p.m. The corn was high that time of year, probably about 8 feet tall, and we were about 2 weeks away from harvest. I was locking up for the night, doing my usual rounds of checking the doors and windows, when I heard it. The sound started as a deep rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it was a clear night. Then it transformed into something I can only describe as a cross between a bear's growl and something else. Something deeper, more guttural. It was coming from the edge of the cornfield, maybe 150 yards from my back porch. I've heard all sorts of wildlife over the years, bears, coyotes, even the occasional mountain lion scream. But this was different. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but the corn was too dense to see anything. The stalks were moving, though, and not in a way that suggested wind. Something was moving through there, something big. The next morning I convinced myself it was probably just a black bear. We get them sometimes, though they're not common. I even called the local game warden to ask if there had been any bear sightings. He said there hadn't been any reported in our area for months. That night, it happened again. Same time, around 10:30 p.m., but closer, maybe 100 yards from the house. The sound was clearer this time, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't aggressive exactly, but it felt territorial, like whatever was making that sound wanted me to know it was there. I called my son Kevin, who lives about 20 minutes away. He came over the next morning, and we decided to investigate. I know it probably wasn't the smartest thing to do, but I needed to know what was out there. We started at the edge of the cornfield where I'd heard the sounds. The first thing we noticed were the corn stalks. Several of them were broken about halfway up, not cut or chewed like deer damage, but snapped clean through. As we moved deeper into the field, following what looked like a rough path of broken stalks, we found something that still gives me chills when I think about it. There was a small clearing, maybe 15 feet in diameter, where the corn had been pushed down in a circular pattern. In the center were several branches and small logs, arranged in a way that couldn't have been random. They were stacked in a crude X pattern, with smaller sticks laid across the top. Kevin said it looked like someone had tried to build something, but who would come out here to stack wood in the middle of my cornfield? Then the smell hit us. If you've ever smelled a dead animal that's been sitting in the sun for days, multiply that by 10 and add a heavy dose of rotten eggs. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Kevin actually gagged and had to step back. The weird thing was, we couldn't find any source for the smell. No dead animals, no garbage, nothing. We were about to head back when we heard movement in the tree line about 50 yards ahead of us. I still remember the absolute silence that fell over everything at that moment. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence. That's when we saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow between two trees, but then it moved. Whatever it was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was broad too, much wider than any person I've ever seen. The thing that really got me was how it moved. Smooth and deliberate, like it knew exactly what it was doing. It was dark-colored, but not black, more of a dark brown or dirty gray. Kevin and I just stood there, frozen. I remember wanting to run but being terrified to make any sudden movements. The figure stayed partially hidden behind the trees, swaying slightly. Then it made that sound again. That same deep, rumbling growl I'd heard the previous nights, but this time I could feel it in my chest. It was like standing next to a subwoofer. We backed away slowly at first, then turned and ran like hell back to the house. I know running was probably the worst thing we could have done, but instinct took over. By the time we got back to the house, we were both out of breath and shaking. We spent the rest of the day inside, watching the cornfield from the windows. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Kevin stayed over that night, and we heard the sound one more time, much further away, maybe from the other side of the property. That was the last time I heard it. The figure never came back, at least not that I noticed. But things changed after that. The deer that used to frequent my property stopped coming around. My dog refuses to go near that part of the cornfield even now, 3 years later. I found a few more of those stick formations over the next couple of months, but they eventually stopped appearing too. I've gone over that day in my head countless times. I've tried to rationalize what we saw. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, though how they could have made those sounds is beyond me. But deep down, I know it wasn't any of those things. Whatever we saw that day was something else entirely. I've never reported this officially. Who would I even report it to? The police? The Game Commission? I'd sound crazy. Kevin and I have talked about it a few times, but we usually just end up shaking our heads and changing the subject. Some things you just can't explain, and maybe we're better off not knowing. I still live in the same house, and I still farm the same land. But I don't go out at night anymore, at least not alone. And every year when the corn gets tall, I find myself listening a little more carefully, watching the tree line a little more closely, wondering if whatever it was is still out there, watching and waiting. The strange thing is, after this happened, I started hearing stories from other farmers in the area. Nothing as direct as what we experienced, but similar things. Weird sounds at night, broken trees, that same terrible smell. Nobody wants to talk about it openly, but you can see it in their eyes when the subject comes up. They've seen something too, something they can't explain. I don't know what was in my cornfield that day. I don't know if it was what some people call Bigfoot, or if it was something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it changed the way I look at these woods forever. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed and the corn is high, I still hear echoes of that growl in my mind, and I wonder if maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. I live in a fairly remote part of the county, about 2 miles outside of Amherst. My house sits on a 5-acre lot that backs up to a mixture of pine forest and marshland. Been here since 2003, and I've always loved how quiet and peaceful it is. Well, was, I should say. It started after a massive snowstorm hit our area on January 12, 2009. We got hammered with about 18 inches of snow overnight. I remember the date clearly because my son Jason was supposed to have a basketball game that evening, but school got cancelled. The storm was so bad that the county had declared a snow emergency, and everyone was advised to stay home. The next morning, I got up early to start clearing my driveway. The snow had stopped around 4 a.m., and the sky had cleared up, leaving everything covered in this pristine white blanket. The temperature was around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, -9 degrees Celsius, and there wasn't a breath of wind. You know that weird silence that comes after a heavy snow? It was like that, but even more intense somehow. I was about halfway done with the driveway when I noticed something odd near the tree line at the edge of my property. At first, I thought maybe some deer had come through, but as I got closer, I realized these weren't deer tracks, not even close. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. There was a line of footprints, perfectly spaced, cutting across my property from the forest edge toward my neighbors' houses. But these weren't normal footprints. Each one was easily 16 inches long and about 7 inches wide. They were clearly foot-shaped. You could make out what looked like toe impressions at the front, but the size was just wrong. The spacing between the prints is what really got to me. Each step was at least 5 feet apart, maybe more. I'm 6'1" and when I tried to match the stride, I couldn't even come close without jumping, and even then I couldn't maintain that spacing consistently. I ran inside and got Jason, who was 15 at the time. I needed someone else to see this because I was starting to question my own eyes. When he saw the tracks, his face went pale. We followed them together, taking pictures with my old flip phone. I wish I still had those pictures, but the phone died years ago and I lost everything on it. The tracks were perfectly straight, like whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. They led from the forest, across my property, and continued through the yards of 3 of my neighbors before disappearing into a marshy area about a 1/4 mile from my house. What made it even stranger was how clean the prints were. In that deep snow, you'd expect some dragging or shuffling, especially with prints that big. But each one was perfectly formed, like something incredibly heavy had just stepped straight down and straight up again. That night, things got weirder. Around 9:30 p.m., I was watching TV when I heard it. It started as a low, rumbling sound that I initially thought was a snowplow in the distance. But then, it changed into something I can only describe as a mix between a wolf's howl and the sound a moose makes. But much, much deeper. It was coming from the direction of the marsh, where we'd lost track of the prints. Jason heard it too. He came running downstairs asking what the hell that was. We stood in the kitchen, lights off, looking out the window toward the marsh. The moon was nearly full, reflecting off the snow, so visibility was pretty good. That's when we saw something that still gives me chills. At the edge of the marsh, maybe 200 yards from our house, there was this dark figure. It was just standing there, half hidden behind a cluster of bare trees. The moonlight made it hard to make out details, but I could tell it was tall, much taller than any person should be. It was broad, too, with what looked like really wide shoulders. We watched it for maybe 30 seconds before it moved. It didn't walk away or run. It just seemed to melt back into the shadows of the trees. No sound, no breaking branches, nothing. Just there one moment and gone the next. The next morning, I went out to check the area. The snow had started falling again overnight, and any tracks from the previous day were already filling in. But I found something else that made my blood run cold. About 50 yards into the marsh, I found a cluster of trees where the bark had been stripped off about 8 feet up the trunk. Not like a deer would do it. This was stripped in huge chunks, and there were what looked like claw marks in the wood underneath. Over the next few weeks, I kept hearing that same howl, always at night, always from different directions around the marsh. Sometimes it would be really distant, sometimes close enough to make the windows vibrate slightly, but I never saw the figure again. The last strange thing happened about a week later. I woke up one morning to find our trash cans knocked over. This wasn't unusual. We sometimes get raccoons or bears in the warmer months. But this was different. The metal cans were actually dented inward, like something had squeezed them, and there was one single footprint in the snow beside them, the same kind we'd seen before, only this time it was pressed into ice-crusted snow so hard that it had cracked through to the ground beneath. After that, everything just stopped. The howls ceased. No more tracks appeared, and life gradually returned to normal. The only lasting change is that I installed motion sensor lights all around my house, and I never go out to the marsh alone anymore, especially not at night. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was some kind of large animal I just couldn't identify. Maybe the tracks were some kind of strange natural phenomenon. Maybe the figure by the marsh was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those tracks were made by something walking on 2 legs, something huge, something that shouldn't exist in the woods of central Wisconsin. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. My wife thinks it was probably a bear, even though bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended distances, and they're supposed to be hibernating in January. Jason still gets uncomfortable talking about it. My neighbors either didn't notice anything or didn't want to discuss it. Sometimes when I'm out splitting wood or working in the yard, I get this feeling like I'm being watched. It's probably just paranoia, but I can't help wondering if whatever made those tracks is still out there, moving silently through the forests and marshes of Portage County, leaving only the faintest traces of its passage. I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. Those tracks were real. That figure was real. And whatever made that sound was definitely real. I just wish I knew what it was. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened that night in 2012 at Morgan's Lake in southeastern Ohio still haunts me. I've spent the last 12 years trying to rationalize what my friends and I experienced, but I can't explain it away. I'm not some conspiracy theorist or attention seeker. I'm just a regular guy who loves camping and fishing, or at least I used to. It was early October, around the 8th or 9th. My buddies Mike, Dave, and Chris had gotten permission from Mike's uncle to camp at his private lake property near McConnellsville. It's pretty remote, about 15 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. We'd been there plenty of times before, usually for weekend fishing trips. The lake itself isn't huge, maybe 3 acres, but it's deep and well stocked. We arrived around 2 p.m. that Saturday. The weather was perfect, clear skies, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with that crisp fall feeling in the air. We set up our campsite about 50 yards from the lake's edge on a small cleared area overlooking the water. The spot was surrounded by old-growth oak and maple trees, with some dense underbrush beyond that. We had 2 tents, a decent-sized fire pit, and all our usual gear. Everything was normal for the first few hours. We got camp set up, cracked some beers, and Chris and I took the canoe out while Mike and Dave fished from the shore. Around 5:30 p.m., as the sun was starting to get low, things began to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. If you've spent time in the woods, you know there's usually a constant background noise, birds, insects, small animals, but it all just stopped. At first I thought maybe a storm was coming, but the sky was still clear. That's when we noticed the smell. I've been around skunks before, but this was different. It was like a skunk mixed with wet dog and rotting meat. The odor was so strong it made my eyes water. Dave actually gagged. We figured maybe there was a dead animal nearby, but we couldn't find anything when we looked around. Around 7 p.m., after we'd eaten dinner and were sitting around the fire, we heard the first scream. I've heard bobcats and coyotes, but this was nothing like that. It was deeper, more guttural, and seemed to come from something much larger. It sounded almost human, but not quite. The scream came from the dense woods beyond the north side of the lake, maybe 200 yards away. Chris laughed it off, but I could tell everyone was on edge. We decided to stay close to the fire and keep talking, trying to act normal. That's when the rock throwing started. I'll never forget the sound of that first boulder hitting the water. It wasn't just a splash. It was like someone had dropped a refrigerator into the lake. The impact sent waves all the way to the shore. We all jumped up and grabbed our flashlights. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, standing between 2 large oak trees, was something that shouldn't exist. In the beam of my LED flashlight, I could make out a massive figure, at least 8 feet tall. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that straight, and they don't have shoulders like that. This thing had a torso like a bodybuilder, covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the eyes that got me. When my light hit them, they reflected back a bright yellow-orange, like a cat's eyes, but much larger, and set in a face that looked almost ape-like. The creature stayed there for maybe 10 seconds, just staring at us. Then it made this low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but deeper, more resonant. That's when we heard a response call from somewhere off to our right, deeper in the woods. The thing looked in that direction, then back at us, and took a step forward. Dave completely lost it. He grabbed the box of fireworks we'd brought for fun and started lighting them off, one after another. The sudden explosions and light seemed to startle the creature. It moved with incredible speed for something so large, disappearing into the tree line. But it wasn't over. For the next 4 hours we experienced what I can only describe as psychological warfare. The creature, or creatures, we were pretty sure there were at least 2, would circle our camp, just out of sight. They'd break massive branches, we found some the next day that were thicker than my thigh, make those terrible screaming sounds, and occasionally throw more rocks into the lake. Around 9 p.m., Mike decided to try to make it to his truck to get his rifle. He'd barely made it halfway there when something huge crashed through the underbrush right toward him. He sprinted back to the fire, and I swear I could hear heavy footsteps right behind him, stopping just at the edge of the firelight. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. Every time we'd shine our lights into the darkness, we'd catch glimpses of those eyes, always in different locations, sometimes low to the ground, as if the thing was crouching, sometimes up high in the trees. The smell would come and go in waves, getting stronger whenever the creatures seemed closer. Around 11:30 p.m., something changed. The creatures started making different sounds, not screams anymore, but something that sounded almost like speech. Not English or any language I know, but definitely structured sounds, like they were communicating with each other. That's when we heard heavy footsteps circling our camp, getting closer and closer. We'd been huddled around the fire for hours, taking turns watching different directions. Our phones had no signal, and we were too terrified to try running to the vehicles again after what happened to Mike. We kept the fire blazing as high as we could, using up almost all our firewood. Then, around 1 a.m., it just stopped. The footsteps, the sounds, the smell, everything just ceased. We stayed awake all night, jumping at every little noise. But whatever they were, they seemed to have left. When dawn finally came, we practically ran to our vehicles. We found evidence the next morning, massive footprints in the soft ground near the lake, at least 16 inches long, broken branches that would have taken enormous strength to snap, and several rocks in the lake that hadn't been there the day before, including one that must have weighed at least 200 pounds. I've never gone back to that lake. Mike's uncle still owns the property, and he told us that over the years, other people have reported strange experiences there, though none quite as intense as ours. Local folks call it the Grassman. Apparently there have been similar sightings in that part of Ohio going back decades. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I wouldn't have believed them. But 4 grown men don't hallucinate the same thing for hours. We don't talk about it much anymore, but when we do, our stories haven't changed. Whatever we encountered that night was real, it was intelligent, and it wasn't alone. The experience changed me. I haven't gone camping since then, and I get anxious even hiking in dense woods. Sometimes I still wake up hearing those screams or remembering those eyes reflecting in my flashlight beam. I don't know what the Grassman is, but I know what I saw, and I know there are things in this world we don't understand. I'm a lifelong hunter from Grant County, Wisconsin, and I've spent countless hours in the woods. What we saw that day wasn't anything natural, wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or since. It was October 12th, right after harvest season. The morning was crisp, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze coming from the northwest. My son Tommy, who was 15 at the time, and I were scouting for deer hunting spots on my brother-in-law's property, about 12 miles outside of Lancaster. The property has about 80 acres of mixed woodland that borders a recently harvested grain field. We'd hunted there before, but that year the deer patterns had changed due to the early harvest. We arrived around 6:45 a.m., just as the sun was starting to come up. The field was covered in that early morning frost that makes everything sparkle, and there was this thin layer of mist hanging just above the ground. We parked my old F-150 at the edge of the tree line and started walking along the border of the woods, looking for fresh deer signs and thinking about where to set up our blind for the upcoming season. The first weird thing I noticed was the silence. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that early morning is usually full of sound, birds, small animals, all that natural activity. But as we walked along the edge of that field, everything just stopped. At first I didn't think much of it. Sometimes that happens when deer are moving through. But this was different. It felt heavy, if that makes any sense. Tommy noticed it too. I saw him keep looking around, kind of nervous-like. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when this smell hit us. God, I'll never forget that smell. It was like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've gutted plenty of deer and dealt with all sorts of animal smells, but this was something else entirely. I remember checking my watch. It was 7:12 a.m. I know because right after I looked at my watch, Tommy grabbed my arm. That's when I saw it. About 200 yards out in the field, this thing was walking through the stubble. At first, my brain tried to make it make sense. Maybe it was a hunter in a ghillie suit. Maybe it was a bear, even though we rarely get bears in that area. But no, this thing was huge. I'm 6'2", and this creature had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown, almost black hair, not fur like a bear. This was more like long, matted hair. The way it moved was what really got me. It walked upright, but with this fluid, powerful motion that no person in a suit could replicate. The creature was moving from east to west across the field, and I don't think it noticed us at first. We stood there frozen. I couldn't even breathe. Then the wind shifted. The thing stopped dead in its tracks and turned its head toward us. I've been face to face with angry bucks, had close calls with wounded deer, but nothing prepared me for what I felt when that thing looked at us. Its face. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. The eyes were dark, intelligent, and absolutely terrifying. That's when it let out this sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't like any animal call I've ever heard. Not a howl, not a scream, but something in between. It was so loud it seemed to vibrate in my chest. Birds exploded from the trees behind us. Tommy started crying, and I'm not ashamed to say I was close to it myself. The creature took 2 massive steps toward us, covering an impossible amount of ground. I grabbed Tommy and started backing up toward the truck, never taking my eyes off it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep hold of my son's jacket. The thing was just standing there, watching us, and that was almost worse than if it had charged. We backed up maybe 50 yards when it made that sound again. This time it was different, almost like it was calling to something. That's when I heard rustling in the woods behind us. I don't know if there was actually another one or if it was just the wind or wildlife, but I wasn't about to find out. We turned and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. Tommy was right beside me, and I could hear him wheezing from fear and exertion. The truck felt like it was miles away. The whole time we were running, I kept expecting to feel something grab us from behind. That smell followed us the whole way, getting stronger and weaker with the wind. When we finally reached the truck, my hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys. Tommy was crying and kept saying, "Get them, get them, get them," over and over. I finally got the door open, and we jumped in. I started the engine and reversed so fast I nearly hit a tree. As we were speeding away, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I swear I saw something dark moving at the edge of the trees. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, about 2 miles away. I pulled over, and we just sat there trying to catch our breath. Tommy threw up on the side of the road. I couldn't stop shaking. The whole thing probably lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. We drove straight home and didn't tell anyone for weeks. Who would believe us? My wife noticed something was wrong. We both had trouble sleeping, and Tommy refused to go hunting that season. I finally told her around Christmas, but I could tell she thought we'd just scared ourselves over nothing. I went back to the spot a week later, alone. I know it was stupid, but I had to know. I found some strange tracks in the mud near the tree line. They were huge, maybe 16 inches long, but the recent rain had made them too distorted to be sure of what made them. The weird thing was the smell. It was still there, faint but distinctive even a week later. That was 14 years ago, and I still hunt, but never in that spot. Tommy's 29 now with kids of his own, and he still won't go near that field. We don't talk about it much, but sometimes when we're together and someone mentions something about strange creatures or unexplained encounters, we just look at each other. And I know we're both thinking about that morning. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Could it have been a bear, a person in a suit, some kind of mass hysteria between me and my son? But I know what we saw. That thing was real, it was intelligent, and it was nothing that should exist in the woods of Wisconsin. I still get up early to hunt sometimes, but now when that pre-dawn silence falls over the woods, I find myself listening for that sound again, hoping I never hear it. The thing that really gets me, even now, is the way it looked at us. There was intelligence there, maybe even curiosity. It wasn't just some animal reacting on instinct. It knew we were there, it knew we saw it, and it chose to let us go. Sometimes I wonder if that's not the scariest part of all. I've spent my entire life in these woods around Cambridge, Ohio. As a tribal elder of my community, I've heard all the old stories passed down through generations about the tall ones, the forest people, the ones our ancestors spoke of in whispers. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced last fall. It was October 15th, 2023. The weather had been unusually warm for autumn, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze rustling through the trees. I was doing my regular evening patrol of our tribal lands, about 15 miles south of Cambridge, checking on some reports of unusual activity near our sacred grounds. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows through the oak and maple trees. I've walked these paths thousands of times, but something felt different that evening. The woods were too quiet. Normally you'd hear squirrels chattering, birds calling, all the usual forest sounds. But there was this stillness. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My skin started to prickle, and I felt that ancient instinct our people have always talked about, the feeling of being watched. The first thing that caught my attention was the smell. Anyone who spent time in these woods knows their natural scents: earth, leaves, sometimes the musty odor of decomposing vegetation. But this was different. It was a heavy, musky odor, almost like wet dog mixed with something rotting, but more wild. It wasn't coming from any particular direction, it just seemed to hang in the air. I stopped walking and stood completely still, letting my senses take in everything around me. That's when I noticed the crows. We usually have plenty of them in the area, but they were all gathered in the trees about 100 yards ahead, unusually quiet, all facing the same direction. In my 63 years, I'd never seen them behave like that. As I watched, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It started as a low rumble, almost below hearing range, then built into something between a growl and a moan. It wasn't a bear. I've heard plenty of those. This sound was different. It had a quality to it that seemed almost human, but not quite. It came from somewhere to my left, maybe 200 yards away. That's when the crows suddenly took flight all at once, like an explosion of black wings against the darkening sky. The sound that had spooked them was followed by the distinct crack of breaking branches, not small twigs, but the thick snap of substantial limbs. Whatever was moving through the woods was big, and it was moving with purpose. I'm not ashamed to admit that my hands were shaking as I reached for my flashlight. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving everything in that grey twilight that plays tricks on your eyes. But what I saw next wasn't any trick of the light. Through a gap in the trees, about 150 yards away, I saw it. At first my mind tried to make it into something familiar, a bear standing up maybe, or a shadow cast by the trees. But bears don't stand 8 feet tall. Bears don't have that distinctive head shape, set directly on broad shoulders without much of a neck. And bears don't walk bipedally with that fluid, rolling gait that I witnessed. The creature was massive, covered in dark hair that looked reddish-brown in the fading light. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and even from that distance I could see the muscles rippling under its coat as it moved. The head was cone-shaped, like our elders always described in their stories. For about 15 seconds, I watched it walk between the trees. Its movements were deliberate, almost graceful despite its size. Then, as if sensing my presence, it stopped. I'll never forget what happened next. It turned its head and looked directly at me. The eye shine from my flashlight reflected back with an amber glow, and in that moment I felt something I can't quite explain. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was a recognition of something ancient, something that had walked these woods long before my ancestors first told stories around their fires. Then the creature turned and moved into the thicker forest with shocking speed for something so large. The branches and undergrowth barely seemed to slow it down. Within seconds, it had vanished into the growing darkness, though I could hear its movement for several more minutes, growing more distant. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down. I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, listening to the forest slowly come back to life around me. When I finally felt steady enough to move, I knew I had to document what I'd seen. I took out my phone and turned on its video light, then walked carefully to where I'd seen the creature. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the tracks I found confirmed I hadn't imagined it. The footprints were huge, about 16 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. But what really caught my attention were the smaller tracks nearby. There weren't just one set of prints, but several, including what appeared to be those of a juvenile, maybe 11 inches long. They led deeper into the woods, but I wasn't about to follow them in the dark. I took photos and videos of everything, including measurements using my hand for scale. I also found several broken branches, snapped clean through, some as thick as my arm. These weren't old breaks, the wood was fresh, still moist with sap. But the most compelling evidence came 2 days later. I returned with 3 other tribal elders and 2 wildlife biologists we trust. We found more tracks, and this time We made proper casts. We also found something else, what appeared to be a crude shelter made of broken branches and torn saplings, tucked into a dense thicket about a quarter-mile from where I'd had my encounter. The structure was about 8 feet tall and 12 feet wide, with a distinct entrance and even what looked like a bed of gathered vegetation inside. That night changed everything for me. Since then, we've documented more evidence, strange vocalizations that our audio equipment barely picks up, more tracks, and even thermal images of something large moving through the trees at night. But nothing quite matches the intensity of that first encounter. The most striking thing about the experience wasn't just seeing the creature, it was the feeling I had when our eyes met. In that moment, I understood why our ancestors spoke of these beings with such respect. This wasn't just some unknown animal. There was an intelligence there, a presence that seemed to recognize me as much as I recognized it. Our tribe has since designated this area as protected land, though we've kept the exact location private to prevent curiosity seekers from disturbing whatever lives there. We continue to monitor the area, documenting what we can, but always from a distance and with respect. I know skeptics will say I imagined it all, that the light was playing tricks on me, or that I saw a bear. But I've lived in these woods my entire life. I know what bears look like, how they move, how they behave. This was something else entirely, something that validated every story our elders ever told about the tall ones who share these forests with us. Sometimes at night, especially when the moon is full, we still hear those distinctive calls echoing through the valley. The local dogs still won't go near certain parts of the woods, and occasionally we find fresh tracks that remind us we're not alone in these ancient forests. Whatever I saw that evening, whatever being locked eyes with me in the growing darkness, it's still out there. And maybe, just maybe, it's watching us as carefully as we're watching for it. Oh! I've been a long-haul trucker for over 45 years now, but what I saw that night in '73 still haunts me. I've driven millions of miles across this country, seen all kinds of wildlife, but nothing comes close to what happened on that stretch of I-5 near the Oregon border. It was October 12th, 1973, the kind of detail you never forget. I was hauling a load of lumber from Seattle down to Sacramento, running the night shift like I usually did to avoid traffic. The clock on my dash showed 2:15 a.m., and there was hardly anyone else on the road. The moon was nearly full that night, casting an eerie glow through patches of fog that had settled in the valleys. I'd just passed the last rest stop before the Oregon border, probably about 15 miles south of Medford. The forest was thick on both sides of the interstate, tall pines and dense undergrowth that seemed to swallow up the darkness. The air was crisp, probably in the low 40s, and there was this light drizzle that had been falling on and off for the last hour. I remember adjusting my thermos of coffee in the cup holder when my headlights caught something moving in the tree line to my right. At first I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. You see all sorts of things when you're driving these long stretches at night. But then it stepped out onto the shoulder of the road. I've never hit the brakes so hard in my life. My rig was empty, thankfully, or it might have jackknifed. The thing that walked out, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was massive, not just tall, but built like a linebacker times 2. The fur was this dark brown, almost black color, matted down from the rain. But what struck me most was how it moved, smooth, purposeful, like it knew exactly where it was going. I'm not talking about some bear walking on its hind legs. I've seen plenty of bears in my time. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, probably closer to 9. Its arms were proportional to its body, swinging naturally as it walked. The shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering down to a more narrow waist. The head sat directly on those shoulders, no neck to speak of. As my truck came to a stop, 2 more vehicles behind me did the same, a station wagon and a pickup truck. The creature turned its head toward our lights, and I swear I could see its eyes reflect red for just a second. It didn't seem startled or afraid. If anything, it looked annoyed at the interruption. Then it did something I'll never forget. It crossed all 4 lanes of the interstate in about 4 strides. 4 strides. Each step had to cover at least 6, 7 feet. The power in those legs. You could see the muscles moving under the fur. It wasn't running, just walking with purpose. I rolled down my window, not even thinking about what I was doing. The smell hit me immediately. This horrible, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I can't even describe. The air felt heavy with it. The whole encounter probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but time seemed to stand still. As it reached the other side of the highway, it disappeared into the tree line like it was nothing. No crashing through branches, no sound at all. Something that big shouldn't be able to move that quietly. The driver of the station wagon, I never got his name, got out of his car and walked up to my truck. He was shaking, and I could see he was as white as a sheet even in the dim light. Did you see that?" he kept asking. The pickup truck driver joined us too. None of us knew what to say. We stayed there for maybe 15 minutes, just talking in hushed voices about what we'd seen. The station wagon driver wanted to call the police, but this was 1973, no cell phones. The pickup driver thought we should investigate the woods, but none of us were crazy enough to actually do it. What strikes me most, looking back, was the absolute silence that fell over everything. No crickets, no birds, nothing. Even the usual highway sounds seemed muffled. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. I've heard all the theories over the years, that it was someone in a suit, that we were all tired and seeing things. But I know what I saw. You don't drive trucks for as long as I have without learning to trust your eyes. The way it moved, the muscle definition, the proportions. No costume in 1973 could have looked like that. And that smell. You can't fake something like that. The strange thing is, after it disappeared into the woods, we never heard anything crash through the underbrush. Something that size should have made noise moving through the trees, but there was nothing. Just complete silence. I reported it to the local sheriff's office the next day, but they just took my statement and filed it away. I heard later that there had been other sightings in that area over the years, but nothing as clear as what we saw that night. I changed my route after that, started taking I-84 instead. Couldn't bring myself to drive that stretch of I-5 at night anymore. Even now, decades later, when I pass through that area during daylight hours, I can't help but scan the tree line. Sometimes I think I catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but I never stop to look anymore. That night changed how I see the world. There are things out there we can't explain, things that don't fit into our neat little boxes of what should and shouldn't exist. I've never been a superstitious man, never believed in monsters or myths, but after what I saw that night, well, let's just say I keep my high beams on when I'm driving through wooded areas now. The memory is as clear today as it was back then. The way it moved, the intelligence in its bearing, the sheer size of it. These aren't things you forget. I've told this story 100 times over the years, and every time I tell it, I remember some new detail, the way its hair moved in the breeze, how its footsteps seemed to vibrate through my truck's chassis, the absolute certainty in its movements. I've seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, and while what I saw was similar, it was different too. Bigger, more muscular. The creature in that film looks almost lanky compared to what crossed the highway that night. This thing was built like a primitive NFL player, all muscle and power. Sometimes I wonder if the other drivers that night think about it as much as I do. We never exchanged information, didn't even think to in the moment. We were all too shocked, too caught up in trying to process what we'd just witnessed. I often wish I could talk to them now, compare memories, see if they remember the same details I do. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know what I saw, and that's enough for me. But I will say this, if you're ever driving that stretch of I-5 late at night, keep your eyes on the tree line. And if you smell something that makes your nose curl and your stomach turn, don't stop. Just keep driving. Some things are better left alone. I've never been quite sure about sharing this story. Even now, 45 years later, my hands get shaky just thinking about what happened that night on Highway 36. I've always been interested in the unexplained, spent countless nights stargazing and tracking strange lights in the sky. But what my daughter and I encountered that evening in '79 was something entirely different. I was 34 at the time, working as an electrical engineer in Eureka, and my daughter Sarah was 12. We were driving back from visiting her grandparents in Red Bluff. It was late October, around 7:30 p.m., and the sun had already set. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year. No fog, just a crisp autumn night with a quarter moon providing decent visibility. For those unfamiliar with Highway 36, it's this winding road that cuts through some of the most remote parts of Northern California. The stretch we were on was about 30 miles east of Bridgeville, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. There weren't any houses or buildings for miles, just thick woods and the occasional logging road. I was driving our '76 Ford Granada, keeping it around 45 miles per hour because of all the curves. Sarah had dozed off in the passenger seat, and I had the radio turned low, some classic rock station that kept cutting in and out. The headlights were catching the reflective road markers, and occasionally I'd see deer eyes glinting from the tree line. The first thing that struck me as odd was how the crickets suddenly went silent. You know how the forest usually has this constant background noise? It just stopped. At first I thought maybe it was just the car's engine drowning everything out, but when I slowed down to take a sharp curve, there was nothing. Complete silence. That's when I noticed the smell. Anyone who spent time outdoors knows the usual forest smells: pine, damp earth, sometimes a skunk or dead animal. This was different. It was this overwhelming, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. It was so strong it actually made my eyes water. I remember thinking maybe we'd passed a dead bear or something. I was about to wake Sarah to roll up her window when movement caught my eye in the high beams. At first I thought it was a bear. We'd seen plenty in the area before. But as the figure emerged from the right side of the road, I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. This thing was massive. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall. The body was covered in dark matted fur that looked almost reddish-brown in the headlights. But it wasn't just the size that made my blood run cold. It was how it moved. This wasn't some person in a costume. The stride was too long, too fluid. It covered the width of the highway in what seemed like 2 steps. I instinctively hit the brakes, not hard enough to skid, but enough to slow down considerably. The creature turned its head toward our car, and I got a clear look at its face. The features were somewhere between ape and human, with deep-set eyes that reflected red in the headlights. The brow ridge was prominent, and the head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders with barely any neck visible. What really stands out in my memory is the arms. They were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees. The hands were massive, easily twice the size of a human's, with what looked like dark skin on the palms visible even in the dim light. The whole encounter probably lasted no more than 5, 6 seconds, but time seemed to slow down. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. The creature crossed the road with this purposeful stride and disappeared into the forest on the left side. The movement was so smooth, so natural, like a person crossing the street, but at a scale that shouldn't be possible. Sarah woke up during the braking and caught the last moment of it disappearing into the trees. She grabbed my arm and asked, "Dad, what was that?" I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. We sat there for a moment, the engine idling. The silence in the forest was still absolute. No crickets, no birds, nothing. Just our breathing and the low rumble of the Granada's engine. I remember reaching for the glove compartment where I kept a small notebook. I used it to record my astronomy observations, and writing down the time and location with trembling hands. The smell lingered for several minutes as we sat there, trying to process what we'd seen. I wanted to get out and look for tracks. The amateur scientist in me desperately wanted evidence, but something primitive in my brain screamed against it. Every instinct told me to stay in the car. When we finally started moving again, I kept the speed well above what was safe for those curves. The silence in the forest followed us for at least another mile before the normal nighttime sounds gradually returned. Sarah and I barely spoke for the rest of the trip home, but we both knew we'd experienced something extraordinary. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what we saw. I've spent countless hours researching bears, studying their movements and behavior. I've looked into the possibility of escaped circus animals or someone in a costume. None of these explanations fit what we encountered that night. I've seen a lot of strange things in my life. Unexplained lights in the sky, objects moving in ways that defied physics. But this was different. This was solid, physical, and undeniably real. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate nature of its actions. This wasn't some mindless animal. The encounter changed how I view the world. Before that night, my interest in the unexplained was mostly academic, tracking UFOs, recording strange phenomena, trying to make sense of it all through the lens of science. But what we saw on Highway 36 showed me that some things can't be easily categorized or explained. Sarah and I have talked about it over the years. She remembers it clearly, though she only saw the last few seconds. We've never reported it officially. Who would believe us? An engineer and his daughter claiming to see a giant upright walking creature on a remote highway. But we know what we saw. I still drive that stretch of Highway 36 occasionally. The road's been improved over the years, but the forest remains as dense and mysterious as ever. Every time I pass that spot, I can't help but slow down a little, scanning the tree line. The smell sometimes comes back to me in dreams, that distinct musky odor that's unlike anything else in nature. I've read other accounts of Bigfoot sightings since then, and many details match our experience. The sudden silence in the forest, the smell, the fluid movement. But reading about it and experiencing it firsthand are worlds apart. There's a visceral reality to our encounter that no written description can fully capture. What strikes me most, looking back, is how the creature seemed completely indifferent to our presence. It wasn't aggressive or frightened. It was simply crossing the road, going about its business in what it probably considered its territory. We were the intruders, not it. I'm sharing this now because I'm older, and I've come to realize that some truths are worth telling, regardless of whether people believe them or not. I know what we saw that night was real. It wasn't a hallucination, wasn't a hoax, and wasn't a misidentified bear. It was something that shouldn't exist according to our scientific understanding, yet there it was, crossing Highway 36 on an autumn night in 1979. The experience taught me something important. The world is far more mysterious than we imagine. As someone who spent his life looking up at the stars and questioning what's out there, I never expected to find something so profound and unexplainable right here in our own forests. It makes me wonder what other secrets these woods hold, what other creatures might be living just beyond the reach of our understanding. I was 15, and my brother Wyatt was 12. We lived in Lebanon, Oregon, right where the foothills of the Cascade Mountains start to get serious. Our house sat on 3 acres backing up against the Willamette National Forest, which probably wasn't the safest setup in retrospect, but as kids, we thought it was paradise. Wyatt was always the wild child, the kind of kid who'd jump off the roof into a pile of leaves or try to catch snakes with his bare hands. I was supposed to be the responsible one, keeping him in check, but honestly, I usually just ended up getting dragged into his schemes. That summer was particularly dry, and Dad had been extra clear about the fireworks rules. Nothing bigger than sparklers, and absolutely no Roman candles or bottle rockets. Of course, that just made Wyatt want them more. We had this neighbor, old Mr. Peterson, who sold fireworks from his garage every year. He wasn't exactly strict about age restrictions, and that morning while Dad was at work, Wyatt convinced me to pool our allowance money for some real fireworks. I knew better, but I went along with it anyway. We bought a bunch of stuff, including 3 Roman candles that Wyatt immediately stuffed into his backpack. It was around 4 p.m. when things went sideways. We were hanging out in our backyard, and Wyatt kept pestering me to let him try out one of the Roman candles before dark. I kept saying no, but you know how little brothers are. He just wouldn't let it go. When I went inside to grab some sodas, he must have swiped one from his backpack because next thing I knew, I heard that distinctive whistle and pop. I ran outside to find Wyatt shooting the Roman candle randomly into the trees at the edge of our property. The colored balls of fire were bouncing off branches and disappearing into the forest. I was about to tackle him when he suddenly froze. The last shot had gone deep into the woods, and there was this sound. Not an echo, but this weird, deep grunt that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Wyatt dropped the spent Roman candle, and we both just stood there. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. In Oregon summers, the forest is never quiet like that. Never. Then we heard it, the crack of branches breaking, but not like when a deer moves through. These were big branches, and whatever was moving was heavy. The thing about living next to national forest is you get used to wildlife. We'd seen black bears, cougars, even the occasional elk. But this was different. Through the dense Douglas firs, about 50 yards in, something massive was moving. The trees were swaying, but there wasn't any wind. That's when the smell hit us. Everyone talks about the smell when they tell these stories, and they're right. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Wyatt grabbed my arm, and I could feel him shaking. Then we saw it. Not clearly at first, just a dark shape moving between the trees. But it was huge. I'm not talking bear huge. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its head was almost level with the lower branches of the mature firs. The fur was this dark reddish-brown color, matted in places, but what I remember most was how it moved. Not like an animal on 4 legs, but upright, deliberate. It stopped behind a thick tree trunk, and I swear to God it was watching us. We couldn't see its face, but you know when you can feel eyes on you? It was like that, but 100 times worse. Then it let out this sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. It started low and built up to this high-pitched howl that made every hair on my body stand up. Wyatt tried to run, but I grabbed him. Whatever this thing was, running might make it chase us. We backed up slowly toward the house, and that's when it stepped partially out from behind the tree. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the forest, but I could see its massive shoulders, the way its arms hung down almost to its knees. The head was cone-shaped, like people describe, but seeing it in person, it just doesn't compare to any description. It took 1 step forward, and that was enough. We turned and ran for the house. I've never moved so fast in my life. We slammed the back door, locked it, and ran upstairs to my parents' room where Dad kept his gun safe. With shaking hands, I called him at work. I couldn't even get the words out properly, but he must have heard the panic in my voice because he just said, "I'm coming home. Lock all the doors and windows. Now." While we waited, we heard it moving around outside. Heavy footsteps in the yard, this weird wooden knocking sound coming from different directions. At one point, something hit the back of the house hard enough to rattle the windows. Wyatt was crying silently, and I was trying to act brave while scared out of my mind. Dad made it home in record time, his truck spraying gravel as he pulled up. He had his hunting rifle with him, the one he usually only took out during elk season. The moment he got inside and saw our faces, he knew this wasn't some teenage prank. He made us tell him exactly what happened, then called a few of his hunting buddies. That's when things got really strange. While Dad was on the phone, this ungodly scream came from the forest, so loud it seemed to shake the whole house. Dad immediately called Mum at work and told her to pick us up and take us to Aunt Sarah's house about 20 miles away. He wasn't taking any chances. We never found out exactly what happened that night. Dad stayed behind with 3 of his friends, all experienced hunters. When we came back the next day, he looked like he hadn't slept. He wouldn't talk about it, just said everything was fine now and we were safe. But I noticed his rifle had been fired, and there were these massive tracks in the soft earth behind our house, tracks that disappeared into the forest. The weirdest part, the scorch mark where that last Roman candle shot had hit. It was on a tree about 7 feet up, and around it were these long, coarse, reddish-brown hairs snagged in the bark. Dad collected them in a plastic bag, but when he tried to get them tested, they mysteriously disappeared from the lab. The technician quit his job the same day, or at least that's what we heard. We never saw it again, but things changed after that. Dad installed motion sensor lights all around the property. We weren't allowed in the backyard after dusk anymore. Wyatt never touched another firework. The forest that had once been our playground became this ominous presence we couldn't ignore. Even now, 26 years later, I can't shake what happened. Every time I hear about a Bigfoot sighting in the Pacific Northwest, I get this cold feeling in my gut, because I know what's out there. I know what we did to it, and sometimes I wonder if it remembers too. Some nights, when I'm visiting my parents' house and everything gets too quiet, I swear I can still hear that knocking in the woods, like it's trying to tell us something. The weird thing is, I feel guilty sometimes. We basically shot this creature with a firework. It had every right to be aggressive, but apart from scaring us half to death, It didn't actually hurt anyone. It could have easily broken down our door or smashed through a window, but it didn't. Maybe it was just warning us, marking its territory. Or maybe it was just as scared and confused as we were. I've read a lot about Bigfoot encounters since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Most stories have this common thread of the creatures being curious, but shy. Ours wasn't like that. This thing was angry, territorial, and smart enough to know exactly how to scare us without actually attacking. That's what keeps me up at night sometimes. Not just that these things exist, but that they're intelligent enough to show restraint even when provoked. Wyatt's got kids of his own now, and he won't let them play in the woods alone. Can't say I blame him. Sometimes when we get together and have a few beers, he'll bring up that day, and we'll try to make sense of it again. But how do you make sense of something that shouldn't exist? All I know is that every 4th of July, when I hear those fireworks going off, I think about what's out there in the dark, watching and waiting, and I make sure all my doors are locked. The city was everything I feared it would be. Within 3 months, I'd been mugged twice and my car was broken into. The constant sirens, helicopter noise, and that suffocating feeling of being surrounded by millions of people, it was all too much. By September, I'd had enough and decided to move to something more familiar. I found a small house on the outskirts of Angeles National Forest, near Sunland Tujunga. It wasn't exactly Bakersfield, but it felt like a good compromise, close enough to LA for work, but far enough to escape the chaos. The house sat on a 2-acre lot backing up against the forest. The rent was surprisingly reasonable, probably because of the wildfire risk and the somewhat remote location. But I loved it. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed. Quiet mornings, clean air, and best of all, hiking trails right in my backyard. Everything changed on October 12th. I remember the date because it was unusually cold for LA, and I decided to take advantage of the weather with an early morning hike. I left my house around 5:30 a.m., wearing my usual gear, hiking boots, cargo pants, and a light jacket. I carried a small backpack with water, some trail mix, and my phone. I'd done this particular trail maybe a dozen times before, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. The first weird thing I noticed was the silence. Usually there were birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, but that morning everything was dead quiet. At first I thought maybe it was just the cold, but something felt off. You know that feeling when you're being watched? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck? Yeah, that's exactly what I felt. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. Then I smelled it. This overwhelming stench like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've smelled dead animals in the woods before, but this was different. This smell had a presence to it, if that makes any sense. That's when I heard the crack of a branch breaking, not like a small twig, but like something massive had stepped on a thick branch. It came from maybe 50 yards to my left, up a small incline dense with trees. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I saw it. Through the trees, something massive moved. At first my brain tried to make sense of it, maybe a bear. But bears don't stand 8, 9 feet tall. This thing was huge, covered in dark brown, almost black hair. The way it moved was what really got to me. Smooth, deliberate, almost human-like, but not quite. It stepped partially into a clearing, and I got a clear look at it. The face. God, the face. It was like a primitive human face, but massive, with a pronounced brow ridge and wide, deep-set eyes that looked unnaturally intelligent. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They looked right at me with what I can only describe as awareness. I'd always laughed at Bigfoot stories, always thought they were made up by attention seekers or confused people who saw bears. But in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. The sound seemed to vibrate in my chest. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran like hell. I made it back to my house in record time, locked all the doors, and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. That night, things got worse. Around 2 a.m., my dogs, I have 2 German shepherds, started going crazy at the back door. Not their usual barking at coyotes or raccoons. This was different. They were whining, growling, and pacing. When I turned on the back floodlights, they illuminated nothing but my yard and the tree line about 50 yards back. But then I saw movement in the shadows, just at the edge of the light. Something massive shifted in the darkness, and that same smell from the morning wafted through my slightly open window. The next morning, I found huge footprints in the soft soil near my garden. They were human-like but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. I took photos, but they came out blurry and unclear in the early morning light. What was clear, though, was the half-eaten deer carcass I found dragged to the edge of my property. It wasn't torn apart like a mountain lion or bear would do. It looked almost deliberately placed. Over the next few weeks, the encounters continued. Every few nights, I'd hear heavy footsteps around my house. My dogs would go berserk, then suddenly fall completely silent, which was even more terrifying. I'd find strange arrangements of broken branches in my yard, and once, all the apples from my apple tree were gone overnight, with massive bite marks in the ones that were left behind. But the most terrifying night was when the wildfire started. It was late October, during a particularly dry spell. I woke up around midnight to the smell of smoke. When I looked out my window, I saw the orange glow of flames in the distance, moving fast with the Santa Ana winds. As I was getting ready to evacuate, I saw it again. The creature was standing at the tree line, perfectly still, watching the approaching fire. But here's the thing that still makes my skin crawl. It seemed to be waiting. As the fire got closer, it turned its head to look directly at my house, then back at the fire. Then it made a series of loud, rhythmic knocks on a nearby tree. Boom, boom, boom. Pause, boom, boom, boom. Within minutes, I heard similar knocking sounds from different directions in the forest. The fire, which had been heading straight for my property, suddenly shifted direction as the wind changed. I know how crazy this sounds, but it was like they were communicating, coordinating somehow. The fire ended up missing my property entirely, taking a different path through the forest. The creature disappeared that night, and I haven't seen it since. But I still hear those knocks sometimes, usually late at night or very early in the morning. My dogs still act strange occasionally, staring into the darkness and whining. I've thought about moving, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's something else. I've researched similar encounters in the area and found a few scattered reports, but nothing quite like what I experienced. The local rangers dismiss it all as bears or mountain lions, but I know what I saw. I still hike those trails, though never alone and never at dawn or dusk. I carry bear spray now, though I'm not sure it would do any good against whatever that was. Sometimes I catch that distinctive smell on the wind, or find massive footprints half hidden in the brush, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Something is out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I swear I can hear those rhythmic knocks in the distance, like some kind of ancient code I'll never understand. It was early October, and the weather had just started to turn. Mike and I were both 19 at the time, working dead-end jobs at the local hardware store, and our favorite way to blow off steam was hanging out in the woods behind his parents' property. We'd been doing this since we were kids, building fires, drinking cheap beers, just being typical small-town guys. That night started like any other. We'd gathered some wood and got a decent fire going around 8 p.m. The spot we always used was about a quarter mile into the woods, near the edge of a limestone quarry that had been abandoned for years. It was perfect because the quarry wall blocked the wind and we could see if anyone was coming from town. The temperature was probably in the low 50s, and there was this weird fog rolling in, not thick, but enough to make everything feel damp. We'd been there maybe 2 hours just talking about work and girls, nothing special. I remember checking my phone around 10:15 p.m. because my mum had texted asking when I'd be home. That's when I first noticed something was off. The woods had gone completely silent. If you've spent any time outdoors at night, you know there's always some noise, crickets, owls, the wind in the trees. But suddenly, nothing. Mike was in the middle of some story about his supervisor, but I wasn't listening anymore. Something felt wrong. I got this intense feeling of being watched. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It was like that, but 100 times worse. I tried to play it cool, didn't want to freak Mike out, but then he stopped talking mid-sentence. He felt it too. The quarry wall behind us was about 30 feet high, with some trees growing along the top edge. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the top of the quarry, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was this massive dark figure. At first my brain tried to make it into something normal, maybe a bear, though we hadn't had bears in the area for decades. But bears don't stand like that. This thing was huge. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, and even in the dim light, I could see dark, matted fur covering its body. But what made my blood run cold were its eyes. 2 glowing red points in the darkness, reflecting our firelight like some kind of demon. Mike whispered, "Holy shit, do you see that?" His voice was shaking. I couldn't even respond. I was frozen in place, watching this thing watching us. The creature shifted slightly, and a branch snapped under its weight. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. That broke our paralysis. We both jumped up at the same time, knocking over our chairs. The creature moved too. It took a step forward, now fully visible at the edge of the quarry. Its movement was fluid, too human-like to be an animal, but too powerful to be a person in a costume. Those red eyes were fixed on us, and I swear I could feel its gaze physically, like ice water running down my spine. We ran. We left everything, the chairs, our backpacks, the fire still burning. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear Mike's ragged breathing beside me as we crashed through the undergrowth. The worst part was the sound behind us, heavy footfalls and breaking branches. Whatever it was following us. The quarter-mile to Mike's backyard felt like 10 miles. We could hear it moving parallel to us, staying just out of sight in the darker parts of the woods. There was this awful smell too, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat. At one point, I heard this deep guttural sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite human speech. I'll never forget that sound. We burst out of the tree line into Mike's backyard, practically falling over each other. The motion lights came on, and I remember his mum opening the back door to see what was going on. We were both gasping for air, covered in scratches from running through brambles. The thing didn't follow us into the light, but standing there in Mike's yard, I could still see those red eyes in the darkness between the trees, watching us. They stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two before disappearing. Mike's mum thought we were drunk or had seen a deer. We didn't tell her what really happened. How do you even begin to explain something like that? We went inside and tried to calm down, but neither of us slept that night. 3 days later, after working up the courage, we went back in daylight to get our stuff. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, the chairs knocked over, the fire pit cold. But what we found around the area made my stomach drop. There were footprints, massive ones, at least 16 inches long and deeply pressed into the soft ground. They led from the top of the quarry, following the path we'd run that night. But here's the really crazy part. Near the fire pit, we found tufts of dark, coarse hair caught on some brambles. It wasn't bear fur or deer hair. I've hunted enough to know the difference. This was something else entirely. Mike wanted to keep it, maybe get it tested, but I wanted nothing to do with it. The whole thing felt wrong, like we'd stumbled into something we weren't supposed to know about. We also noticed claw marks on several trees, not like bear marks, but long, deliberate gouges that went almost 8 feet up the trunks. Some looked fresh, others older. This thing had been in these woods for a while, and we'd had no idea. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but for weeks afterward, we kept hearing strange noises at night, deep, resonating howls that made the windows vibrate, wood knocks that seemed to answer each other across the valley. Mike's dog refused to go outside after dark, and the local wildlife seemed to disappear. The woods felt different, like something had changed fundamentally. We never went back to that fire pit, never hung out in those woods at night again. Mike moved away the following year for college, but I still live in Cardington. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I'll hear those sounds again, those not quite human vocalizations echoing through the trees, and every time I remember those glowing red eyes and the pure primal fear they inspired. I've heard other stories since then, hunters finding strange prints, hikers feeling watched, weird noises in the night, but nobody else has reported seeing the creature itself. Maybe we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe it's still out there, watching and waiting in the darkness of the Ohio woods. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I wouldn't have believed them, but I know what I saw that night. Those eyes, that massive silhouette, the way it moved. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen. Whatever it was, it changed the way I look at the woods forever. These days, I don't go out after dark anymore. Some things are better left alone. I've never found a satisfying explanation for what we encountered that night. The rational part of my brain wants to dismiss it, but then I remember those footprints, that hair, those eyes, and I know that something was out there, something that shouldn't exist, but does. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still there in those woods, watching and waiting for someone else to stumble into its territory. I'm a landscape artist from Spokane, and last summer I finally decided to pursue my dream of becoming a traveling painter. You know those Instagram artists who convert vans into mobile studios and travel the country creating art? That was my plan. I'd saved up enough for a decent used camper, nothing fancy but comfortable enough for me and my two cats, Shadow and Luna. They're my constant companions. Shadow's this big grey Maine coon who thinks he's a dog, and Luna's a skittish black cat who rarely leaves my side. The incident happened about 3 months into my journey. I'd been making my way through some of the more remote areas of Washington state, finding these incredible spots to paint. The freedom was intoxicating. During the day, I'd set up my easel somewhere scenic. The cats would explore nearby, they're both leash-trained, and I'd paint until sunset. We'd developed a comfortable routine. That particular day, I'd been driving along some back roads, looking for my next spot to park for a few days. It was late September, and the weather was getting cooler. I found this secluded turnoff near Mariah's Pass. It's this lesser-known area that local artists sometimes use for landscape painting. The spot was perfect, a clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a view of the mountains in the distance. I figured I'd stay there for a few days to work on some autumn-themed pieces. I arrived just before sunset and parked my camper facing the clearing. The cats were restless after the long drive, so I put them in their harnesses and let them explore a bit while I set up camp. Everything felt normal at first. The air was crisp, there were birds calling, nothing out of the ordinary. I even started a small sketch of the view while there was still light. Around 8 p.m., I brought the cats in and started making dinner. That's when things began to feel different. Shadow, who's usually super chill, kept staring at the window above my bed. At first I didn't think much of it. Cats are weird, right? But then Luna started acting strange too. She was pacing between the windows, her tail all puffed up. If you have cats, you know that when both of them start acting weird at the same time, something's up. I tried to ignore it and focus on my ramen, fancy dinner I know, but then I heard it. This weird shuffling sound outside, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. Now, I'm no stranger to wildlife. I've heard deer, elk, even the occasional bear. This was different. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic, and they were circling the camper. I turned off all the lights except for my small battery-powered lantern. The cats were completely silent now, both crouched under my bed. That's when I noticed the smell. This musty, wet dog kind of odor seeping in through the vents. I've been around plenty of wild animals, but this smell was unique. It made my nose burn slightly. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Then came this sound. It's hard to describe, but imagine a deep, rumbling breath, like something massive was smelling the air. The whole camper vibrated slightly. I was frozen in place, holding my breath, when something bumped the side of the camper. Not aggressively, but with enough force to make everything shake. I reached for my phone to call for help, only to find no signal. Typical for these remote areas. The bumping continued, moving from one side to the other, like whatever it was testing the camper's structure. Each touch seemed curious rather than aggressive, but that somehow made it more terrifying. Then came the scratching. Not the sharp scratching of claws, but more like huge fingers dragging across the metal exterior. The sound set my teeth on edge. I could trace the movement of whatever it was by the sound. It was methodically touching every part of the camper, like it was trying to understand what it was looking at. The scariest moment came when it reached the skylight above my bed. The moonlight was suddenly blocked by something massive. I couldn't make out a clear shape, just this dark mass moving above me. The cats were pressing themselves against my legs, trembling. We all stayed completely still, barely breathing. That's when I heard the vocalization. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was this long, low sound that started like a hum and grew into something between a whale song and wind moving through pipes. It resonated through my entire body. The cats pressed closer to me, and I could feel them shaking. I don't know how long we sat there in the dark. It felt like hours. The thing outside would move away for a few minutes, and I'd start to relax. Then it would return, touching the camper in different places. Sometimes it would make that haunting sound. Sometimes it would just breathe heavily. Around 3 a.m., something in me snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. In what was probably the stupidest decision of my life, I decided to make a run for it. I grabbed the cats, shoved them in their carriers, and got in the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. That's when it happened, the moment that still makes me question my sanity. As I started the engine, something lifted the back of the camper, not just bumped it, lifted it clear off the ground. I could feel the whole vehicle tilting forward. In my rearview mirror, all I could see was darkness, but I felt the weight shift. The cats were yowling in their carriers. I slammed on the gas. There was this terrible scraping sound, and the camper dropped hard onto its wheels. I drove like hell, taking the curves way too fast, not caring if I went off the road. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, about 20 miles away. I parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour gas station and just sat there shaking. When morning came, I had to go back. My art supplies, my laptop, everything I owned was still in the camper. I called a local towing company and convinced the driver to come with me. He probably thought I was crazy, but he agreed. The damage to my camper was weird. The back panel was warped and twisted, but not like it had been hit, more like something had gripped it and pulled. There were these odd indentations in the metal, spaced wide apart, like fingers but far too big to be human. The really strange part? There were no tracks around the camper, despite the soft ground. Just some crushed vegetation and a few broken branches on nearby trees, about 8 feet up. I got the camper towed to a repair shop in town. The mechanic who looked at it kept asking what had hit me, but I couldn't explain. How do you tell someone that something picked up your camper in the middle of the night? The cats wouldn't go back in the camper after that. I ended up selling it and moving back to Spokane. Shadow and Luna are back to their normal selves now, but they still get agitated on certain nights, both staring out the window at nothing I can see. I've researched everything I can about Mariah's past since then. There are a few vague stories about strange encounters in that area, but nothing specific. Some locals avoid it at night, but no one would tell me why. I've thought about going back during the day, maybe trying to find some evidence of what happened, but I can't bring myself to do it. The memory of that sound, that smell, and the feeling of being studied by something I couldn't see, it's still too fresh. I still paint, but I stick to well-traveled areas now. Sometimes when I'm working on a landscape, my hand will start shaking and I'll have to pack up and leave. The worst part is not knowing what it was, what it wanted, or if it's still out there, curious about the strange metal box that got away. This is the first time I've written about what happened. I haven't even told my family. They'd probably think I was crazy or making it up. But I know what I experienced. Sometimes late at night, when I hear the wind moving through the trees outside my apartment, I catch myself listening for that strange, haunting sound again. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I catch a whiff of that musty odor on the breeze. I'm a 23-year-old mechanic, and I've always loved riding my mini bike around the old railroad tracks near my house. It's nothing fancy, just a beat-up Honda Trail 70 that I restored myself. I've been riding those tracks since I was a teenager, and I know every bend, every crossing, and every patch of wilderness around there like the back of my hand. Or at least I thought I did. It was October 15th, around 4:30 p.m. The sun was still up but getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. The weather was perfect, cool enough to wear my favorite hoodie, but not cold enough to need anything heavier. I'd just finished my shift at the garage and decided to take my usual ride to clear my head. The spot where it happened is about 2 miles from town, where the tracks cut through a dense patch of woods. There's this stretch where the trees press in close on both sides, creating this natural tunnel effect. I'd ridden through there hundreds of times before, usually going pretty slow since the ground's uneven with old railroad ties and loose gravel. I remember every detail of that moment so clearly. I was putt-putting along at maybe 15 miles per hour, just enjoying the quiet and the smell of fallen leaves. The only sounds were my bike's engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. That's when something made me slow down, this weird feeling in my gut, like when you know someone's watching you. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get them sometimes in the area, and my first instinct was to slowly back away. But what I saw when I looked to my right, about 30 feet away at the tree line, God, I still get chills thinking about it. This thing was standing there, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree. It was huge. I'm 6'1", and this creature had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted fur, kind of a dirty brown color. But it wasn't the size that froze me in place. It was its face. Its face was wrong. It looked almost human-like, but distorted, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face but got the proportions all wrong. The nose was flatter and wider than a human's, and its mouth, I could see its lips, actual lips, not like an ape's mouth. But those eyes, Jesus Christ, those eyes. They were completely black but somehow caught the light, like polished obsidian, and they were fixed right on me. It was holding this massive branch in its right hand, gripping it like a person would hold a baseball bat. That detail haunts me because it wasn't just clutching it randomly, it was holding it with purpose, with intelligence. Its fingers were wrapped around it exactly like a human's would be. I couldn't move. My hand was frozen on the throttle, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We just stared at each other. 5 seconds, 10, time seemed to stop. What terrified me most was the intelligence I saw in those eyes. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. It was studying me, analyzing me. I could feel its consciousness, its deliberate thought process, and that's what made it so much worse than if it had been just some animal. Then it did something that still makes my blood run cold. It shifted its weight and took one step forward, moving with this fluid grace that something that size shouldn't have. The branch in its hand swung slightly with the movement. That tiny motion snapped me out of my paralysis. I've never been so scared in my life. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even operate the throttle properly. I literally jumped off my bike, didn't even think about it, just pure instinct. The bike fell over with a crash, and I started running alongside it, pushing it as fast as I could. I didn't dare look back. The sound of my boots on the gravel and my ragged breathing seemed impossibly loud. After what felt like forever but was probably only about 50 feet, I managed to get the bike upright and kick-started it. The engine roared to life. I've never been so grateful to hear that sound. I twisted the throttle as far as it would go, not caring about the uneven ground anymore. I just had to get away. The whole ride home is a blur. I took the main road instead of the tracks, going way faster than I should have. I didn't slow down until I was back in my driveway, hands cramping from gripping the handlebars so tight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every detail in my mind, trying to convince myself I'd seen a bear or a transient or anything else. But I couldn't lie to myself. What I saw was something else entirely. Those eyes, that face, the way it held that branch. It was all too deliberate, too intelligent. The next day, I drove my truck out there in broad daylight, hoping to find tracks or some evidence of what I'd seen. I found where my bike had fallen. There were still marks in the gravel, but the ground around the tree where it had stood was covered in leaves, making it impossible to find any footprints. The only thing I found was the branch it had been holding, lying on the ground. It was about 5 feet long and thick as my arm. Looking at it, seeing how heavy it was, just reinforced what I'd seen. The way that thing had held it so casually. I haven't been back on those tracks since. I sold my mini bike last week, couldn't stand looking at it anymore. Every time I did, I'd see those eyes in my mind. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. I used to laugh at those grainy photos and shaky videos. But now I know there are things in our woods that defy explanation. Things that watch and think and understand. The worst part isn't the fear of seeing it again. The worst part is knowing it's out there, intelligent enough to use tools, smart enough to stay hidden, and obviously powerful enough to... I try not to think about what it could have done if it had wanted to. I don't know if it was curious about me or had other intentions, and I'm grateful I didn't find out. I still live in Fulton, still work at the same garage. But I take the long way around those tracks now, even in my truck. Sometimes at night, when I hear rustling in the woods behind my house, I wonder if it's out there, watching. Because that's the thing that really gets to me. It wasn't just some mindless creature. Whatever I saw that day, it was thinking. It was aware. And somehow that makes it 1,000 times more terrifying. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I saw. Those eyes, that face, the way it moved, it's burned into my memory forever. Sometimes I wish I could convince myself it was just my imagination, but I know better. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that watch us from the shadows of the woods. And sometimes, if we're unlucky enough, we catch a glimpse of them. I never thought I'd be back at Mariah's Pass, especially not after what happened to me there 5 years ago. But here I am, writing this with shaking hands, trying to make sense of what my son and I just experienced yesterday. I need to get this down while it's still fresh in my mind, though honestly, I don't think I'll ever forget a single detail of what happened. For context, I'm an experienced hiker and outdoorsman from western Montana. I've spent countless weekends exploring the backwoods around Helena, and I know how to handle myself in the wilderness. But what happened at Mariah's Pass yesterday? Nothing could have prepared me for that. It started with these recurring dreams I'd been having about a hidden lake high up in the pass. They were so vivid, crystal clear water surrounded by towering pines, with this unusual rock formation on the northern shore that looked like a wolf's head. I'd never seen this lake before, but the dreams were so persistent that they started to feel like memories. After weeks of these dreams, I made the decision to go back to Mariah's Pass. My 16-year-old son Darren came with me, partly because he's interested in hiking, but mainly because my wife insisted I shouldn't go alone. Looking back now, that might have saved my life. We left our house in Helena at 5:30 a.m. yesterday morning. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect hiking conditions. We packed standard gear, water, trail mix, first aid kit, bear spray, emergency flares, and our phones, though reception is spotty at best up there. I brought my old Nikon DSLR too, thinking maybe we'd spot some wildlife. The drive to the trailhead took about 2 hours. We pulled into the small gravel parking area around 7:45 a.m. There was only one other vehicle there, a beat-up red pickup truck that looked like it had been there overnight. The morning air was crisp, probably around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze carrying that clean pine scent you only get in the mountains. The first couple of hours were uneventful. We followed the main trail up through the dense pine forest, climbing steadily. Darren kept asking me about the dreams, trying to understand why they were affecting me so much. I couldn't really explain it. They just felt important somehow, like they were pulling me towards something. Around 10:30 a.m., we reached the point where I wanted to leave the marked trail. According to my dreams, the lake should have been about a mile east, through relatively unexplored territory. Darren was hesitant. He's usually eager for adventure, but something was making him uncomfortable. "Dad, maybe we should stick to the trail," he said, and I noticed he was scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. I brushed off his concerns, telling him it was just the stories about my previous experience making him nervous. That was my first mistake. The forest changed as we moved east. The trees grew closer together, older and more gnarled. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled our footsteps. That's when I first noticed the silence. In a healthy forest, you're supposed to hear birds, squirrels, the rustle of small animals. But here, nothing, just the sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of branches in the wind. About half a mile off the main trail, we started finding things that didn't make sense. First, it was just broken branches, not the kind that fall naturally or get snapped by wind, but thick branches broken at heights well above our heads, maybe 8 or 9 feet up. Then we spotted these weird formations of sticks leaned against trees, almost like markers or signs. Darren was getting more anxious. "Dad, something's not right here," he kept saying. I could feel it too, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. But I was so fixated on finding that lake that I ignored every warning sign. Around noon, we stopped for a quick lunch break. That's when we first noticed the smell, this powerful, musty odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. It would come and go with the wind, but each time it returned, it seemed stronger. While we were eating, we heard the first tree knock. If you've never heard one, it's hard to describe, like someone taking a baseball bat to a hollow tree, but impossibly loud. It echoed through the forest, and then silence. Complete silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. Darren grabbed my arm. "Dad, we need to go. Now." His voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear the fear in it. I started to pack up our lunch, trying to move slowly and quietly, when we heard another knock, this time from a different direction, closer. That's when I saw it. Through a gap in the trees, maybe 100 yards away, something massive moved. At first my brain tried to make it make sense. Bear, moose, anything logical. But this was bipedal, at least 8 feet tall, with dark reddish-brown hair covering its entire body. What really got me, though, what still haunts me, was that it was carrying something, a thick branch or log, gripped like a club. In that moment, all my dreams about the lake vanished. Pure survival instinct kicked in. I grabbed Darren's pack, and we started backing away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The creature turned its head toward us, and I'll never forget its face. Not quite human, not quite ape, with deep-set eyes that showed an intelligence that terrified me to my core. We heard another tree knock, this time from behind us, and that's when Darren whispered, "There's more than one." He was right. Through the trees, I could make out at least 2 more dark shapes moving parallel to us, trying to flank our position. What happened next is still a blur. We ran, not back the way we came, they were blocking that path, but perpendicular to our original route, hoping to intersect with the main trail eventually. We crashed through undergrowth, scrambled over fallen logs, all while those tree knocks followed us, getting closer, then farther, then closer again. The worst part was the vocalizations, not the whoops or howls you hear about in documentaries. These were different. Deep, guttural sounds that seemed to vibrate in my chest, mixed with what I can only describe as speech-like patterns. Not English, not any language I know, but definitely structured communication. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we finally broke through onto the main trail. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. The red pickup truck was gone, but our car sat there untouched. We jumped in, and I drove us out of there as fast as I safely could on the mountain roads. The drive home was silent. What could we say? We both knew what we'd seen, but saying it out loud somehow made it more real, more terrifying. It wasn't until we were almost home that Darren spoke up. They were hunting us, weren't they? Like a coordinated hunt. I didn't answer immediately. How do you tell your teenage son that yes, you'd just been prey in an organized hunt by creatures that aren't supposed to exist? But he was right. The way they moved, the tool use, the coordinated knocks. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was intelligent, strategic action. Today, looking at maps of the area, I can't even find where we went off trail. The geography doesn't match my dreams anymore, and maybe that's for the best. Whatever drew me back there, whatever wanted me to find that lake, it wasn't benign curiosity. It was a lure, and I almost walked right into it. I'm writing this down, not because I expect anyone to believe it, but because I need to process what happened. My son's instincts were right from the start, and I should have listened. There's something in Mariah's past that doesn't want to be found, and now I understand why. Some mysteries should stay mysteries. The dreams have stopped now. Maybe that's what they wanted, to show me exactly why I shouldn't go looking for answers. I've learned my lesson. No more off-trail hikes, no more following dream visions, and definitely no more trips to Mariah's Pass. Sometimes, the most important survival skill is knowing when to walk away. One final note. Last night, while cleaning out our backpacks, I found something stuck to the bottom of my boot. A thick, coarse hair, about 6 inches long, reddish-brown, just like what we saw. I could have it analyzed, I suppose, but instead, I burned it. Some questions are better left unanswered. I've never shared this story outside my immediate family before, but what happened that day in Sparta, Ohio, has stayed with me for over 20 years. I was just 12 years old, but every detail is still crystal clear in my mind. It was November 15th, 2003, during deer hunting season. My dad had finally decided I was old enough to join him and my older brother Tommy on their annual hunting trip. The morning started like any other hunting day. We got up well before dawn, around 4:30 a.m., and loaded our gear into Dad's old Ford F-150. The drive to our hunting spot was about 45 minutes from our house in Mount Vernon. Dad had permission from Mr. Johnson, an old family friend, to hunt on his 200-acre property just outside Sparta. It was mostly woodland with some open fields, typical Ohio country. The weather that morning was cold but clear, probably around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. There was a light frost on the ground, and the trees were mostly bare, making visibility in the woods pretty good. We parked the truck near an old barn at the edge of the property around 5:45 a.m. and started our walk to our designated spots. Dad had carefully planned where each of us would set up. He put me in what he called the safest spot, a natural ground blind formed by fallen trees about 150 yards from where he would be. Tommy was positioned about 200 yards to my left, creating a triangle formation between us. Dad made sure we all had our blaze orange vests and hats on, and we each had our two-way radios set to channel 3. The first few hours were uneventful. I remember feeling both excited and slightly bored, the way only a 12-year-old can. I was sitting on my cushion, rifle across my lap, watching my breath form little clouds in the cold air. Around 9:30 a.m., something changed. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a gradual awareness that something felt different. The woods had gotten quieter. Not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but an unnatural silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The squirrels that had been rustling in the leaves earlier were gone. Even the birds had stopped chirping. I remember thinking this must be what Dad meant when he talked about deer moving through the area. But then I caught a smell that I'll never forget. It wasn't like anything I'd experienced before, not quite like a skunk, not exactly like rotting meat, but somehow both of those things and worse. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I remember fighting the urge to gag. That's when I heard it, heavy footsteps moving through the woods behind me. Not the light steps of a deer, but heavy, deliberate footsteps that made twigs snap and leaves crunch. My first thought was that maybe Dad had left his position to check on me, but these steps were too heavy, too spread apart. I turned my head slowly, trying to keep as still as possible. Through the trees, about 75 yards away, I saw what I initially thought was a bear. It was huge, covered in dark brown, almost black fur, but something was wrong with the way it moved. Bears don't walk like that. This thing was walking upright, not on all fours. Its arms were long, swinging at its sides like a person's would. It was tall, way taller than my dad, who's 6'2". I'd guess it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. The fur wasn't shaggy like a bear's. It looked more smooth, almost like a horse's coat, but thicker. What really got me was when it reached a fence line. Instead of dropping to all fours to go under it or climbing over awkwardly like a bear might, it simply stepped over the 4-foot fence like it was stepping over a log. The movement was so human-like it made my stomach turn. I sat there completely frozen. My rifle felt useless in my hands. I wanted to radio Dad or Tommy, but I was terrified of making any noise. The creature stopped walking and turned its head slightly. I couldn't see its face clearly through the trees, but I absolutely knew, it was aware of me. Time seemed to stop. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The thing stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then it made a sound I'll never forget, a low, rumbling growl that turned into something like a sigh, but deeper than any human could make. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It was an acknowledgement. Then it turned and walked away, heading deeper into the woods. Its gait was smooth, nothing like a bear's waddle. Each step was purposeful, almost graceful despite its massive size. I watched until it disappeared into the thicker brush. As soon as it was gone, my hands started shaking so bad I almost dropped my radio. I pressed the button and whispered, "Dad? Dad, are you there?" My voice was trembling. Dad responded immediately, asking if I'd seen a deer. I told him no, but that I'd seen something else, something big. He must have heard the fear in my voice because he said he'd come to me. I heard him approaching a few minutes later, deliberately making noise so he wouldn't startle me. When Dad reached me, I was still shaking. I told him what I'd seen, and his face changed in a way I'd never seen before. He radioed Tommy to come join us, and we decided to end our hunt early that day. But before we left, Dad wanted to check out the area where I'd seen the creature. We found the tracks, and that's when I saw Dad's hands start shaking too. The footprints were huge, easily 15 inches long and 7 inches wide. They were clearly foot-shaped with 5 toes, not at all like bear tracks. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 5 or 6 feet apart. Dad took pictures with his flip phone, but they didn't come out very clear. What really convinced me this was something unknown was a broken branch we found. It was about 8 feet up on a tree, snapped clean off, with fresh bark damage. Dad is over 6 feet tall, and he had to jump to barely touch where the break was. Whatever did that was tall. We also found hair caught on the fence where I'd seen it cross. It was dark brown, coarse, and about 4-5 inches long. Dad collected some and put it in a plastic bag, but we never got it tested. I think he was afraid of what people would say. The drive home was quiet. Tommy tried to convince himself and me that it was just a bear, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad didn't say much at all, but I caught him looking in the rearview mirror more than usual, like he was making sure nothing was following us. We never went back to that specific spot to hunt. Dad made excuses about better hunting grounds elsewhere, but I knew the real reason. We didn't talk about what happened much after that day, but sometimes I'd catch Dad staring off into the woods behind our house with a worried look on his face. The strangest part came about a week later. Mr. Johnson, the property owner, stopped by our house. I overheard him telling Dad that something had been going through his cattle fields at night, making his livestock nervous. He mentioned finding strange tracks and hearing weird noises that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. Dad just nodded and suggested he get a better fence. I'm 32 now, and I've been on many hunting trips since then. I've seen bears, coyotes, and all kinds of wildlife. Nothing has ever moved like what I saw that day. Nothing has ever given me that same feeling of being in the presence of something that wasn't supposed to exist. The memory of that day has never faded. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I'll catch a whiff of something that reminds me of that smell, and my heart will start racing. I've read about other encounters since then, and many details match what I experienced. The unusual silence in the woods, the distinctive smell, the smooth walking gait, the feeling of being watched. I know how this story sounds. If someone told it to me, I'd probably be skeptical too. But I know what I saw that day wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit, and wasn't my imagination. There's something else out there in the woods of Ohio, something that most people don't believe in. But I believe because I've seen it. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. The experience changed how I view the world. It taught me that there are things we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what should and shouldn't exist. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods, but I'm more aware now, more respectful of the unknown. And sometimes when the woods get quiet in that particular way, I know I'm not alone out there. It was late September, and we'd picked our usual spot about 7 miles into the forest, off one of the lesser-used trails. We'd been going there for 3 years straight, so we knew the area pretty well. It's a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, with dense pine forest all around. The nearest proper campground was about 3 miles away, and we liked the isolation. We got there around 2 p.m. that Saturday. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperature in the low 70s, just a light breeze. We set up our 3 tents in a triangle formation, with our fire pit in the middle. Everything was normal. We spent the afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, and just hanging out. Steve brought his new camping stove, and we were planning to cook some burgers for dinner. The first weird thing I noticed was around sunset, maybe 6:30 p.m. The forest got quiet. I mean really quiet. Usually you'd hear all sorts of birds and insects, but everything just stopped. I remember looking at Mike, who was trying to get the fire started, and he noticed it too. Neither of us said anything at first. I guess we didn't want to sound paranoid. Then Chris, who was getting something from his tent, suddenly stood up straight and just stared into the tree line. "Hey guys," he called out, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "Is that you, Dave?" Dave was sitting right next to me, crushing beer cans for packing out later. That's when I saw it too. About 50 yards into the trees, there was something tall standing there. At first, I thought it might be a dead tree trunk, but then it moved, just slightly, but enough to make my stomach drop. It was massive. I'd guess at least 8 feet tall and broad. The light was getting dim, but I could make out a dark silhouette. Steve started laughing nervously. "Very funny, guys. Who brought the gorilla suit?" But nobody was laughing with him. We all knew we were looking at something that shouldn't be there. The smell hit us next. If you've ever driven past roadkill that's been sitting in the sun for days, mix that with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was overwhelming. My eyes started watering. Then we heard the first branch snap. It wasn't like when you're hiking and step on a twig. This sound was like someone breaking a baseball bat in half, then another and another. Whatever it was moving closer to our camp. I've been in the woods my whole life, and I've never heard anything move like that. Each step was accompanied by this deep thud you could feel in your chest. Chris started backing up toward the center of our camp, and I saw his hands were shaking. That's when Dave grabbed his flashlight, one of those big mag lights, and pointed it toward the sounds. I'll never forget what we saw in that beam of light. 2 eyes, glowing red like hot coals, about 7 feet off the ground. They weren't reflecting the light like animal eyes do. They were actually glowing. The thing blinked, and I heard Steve make this choking sound behind me. The creature moved slightly, and for a split second the light caught more of it. Dark, matted fur, massive shoulders, a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, no neck visible. Then it made a sound, not a roar or a growl, but this deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like the lowest bass note you've ever heard, but organic. Wrong. Mike was the first one to snap out of it. "Get in the truck," he said quietly, like he was afraid of startling it. "Now." Nobody argued. We started backing up toward where we'd parked the truck about 30 yards from our camp. That's when it stepped fully into our clearing. Even in the dim light, I could see how its movements were both fluid and powerful. Each step covered about 4 feet, and it was coming straight toward us. We ran. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear it behind us. Not running, but moving at this steady, terrifyingly fast walk. Every few steps, there'd be another crack of a branch or a low rumble. The smell got stronger, like it was right on top of us. We piled into Mike's F-150, and he had the engine started before the last door was even closed. As he threw it into reverse, my window was facing the trees where we'd come from. It was standing there at the edge of the tree line, clearly visible now in the truck's headlights. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its hands— I still have nightmares about those hands. They were huge, with long fingers that didn't look quite right. Mike floored it in reverse until we could turn around, then we got out of there as fast as we could on those dirt roads. Nobody said a word for the first 10 minutes. We were all just breathing hard and trying to process what we'd seen. We spent the night at Mike's place, none of us wanting to go home alone. The next morning, we knew we had to go back for our gear. It was expensive stuff, and we couldn't just leave it there. Plus, I think we all needed to see the place in daylight to convince ourselves we hadn't imagined it. The camp was exactly as we'd left it, except for the area around our tents. The ground was torn up with footprints, huge footprints, about 16 inches long and deeply pressed into the soil. They were clearly defined, showing 5 toes and an arch like a human foot, but massive. What really got to me was how deep they were. Whatever made them had to weigh hundreds of pounds. There were branches broken off the trees around our camp, some of them 8 or 9 feet up. A few trees had these strange marks on them, like something had scraped off the bark with huge claws. Our cooler was crushed, not just dented, but literally squashed flat. The contents were scattered around the camp, but none of the food was touched. We took some photos of the prints and the damage, but they were with Chris's old film camera, and when he got them developed, they came out too blurry to make out any details. Typical, right? But I know what we saw. We all do. We never camped there again. Actually, I haven't been camping since. The others, last I heard, haven't either. Sometimes I look up reports of Bigfoot sightings in East Texas, and there are more than you'd think. Some of them describe exactly what we saw, the red eyes, the deep rumbling sound, the incredible size of it. I don't talk about it much. People either think you're crazy, or they turn it into some kind of joke. But I know what I saw that night. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed and I hear something moving outside my house, I catch a whiff of that smell, just for a second. And I wonder if it remembers us too. I've always been a rational person. I work in IT, I believe in science, and I generally think there's a logical explanation for most things. But what my friends and I experienced that night in June 2004 still haunts me, and I honestly don't have any explanation for it. There were 4 of us, me, my old college roommate Steve, and our friends Mark and Dave. We'd been planning this camping trip for months, trying to recreate the good times we had in college before jobs and families took over our lives. We chose Mohan State Park because it was relatively close to all of us, and we'd heard good things about the fishing along Clear Fork River. We arrived around 2 p.m. on a Friday. The weather was perfect, mid-70s, partly cloudy, with a slight breeze that kept the mosquitoes away. We set up our camp about 150 yards from the river, in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth hemlocks and white oaks. The spot was fairly secluded, maybe half a mile from the nearest occupied campsite. We wanted privacy so we could stay up late, drink some beers, and catch up without bothering anyone. The first sign that something was off came around sunset. We were sitting around the campfire, grilling burgers, when the woods just went quiet. If you spend any time outdoors, you know how unnatural that is. Usually you've got birds, insects, small animals. There's always some kind of background noise. But it was like someone had hit a mute button. Even the river seemed quieter somehow. Dave noticed it first. "Hey, anyone else notice how quiet it got?" We all kind of looked around, and that's when I got this weird feeling like we were being watched. You know that sensation on the back of your neck? Like that, but much stronger. I tried to shake it off. We were grown men after all, but I could tell by everyone's faces that they felt it too. We stayed up until about midnight, drinking beers and telling stories, trying to ignore that persistent feeling of being observed. The fire was dying down, and we were about to turn in when Mark's dog, Rocky, a usually calm chocolate lab, started acting strange. He was facing the tree line behind our tents, his fur standing up, making this low growl I'd never heard him make before. He wouldn't come when Mark called him, which was completely out of character. That's when we heard the first branch snap. It came from about 50 yards behind our campsite, in the direction Rocky was staring. At first we thought it might be a deer. There are plenty of them in Mohican. But then we heard another snap, and another, and these weren't the light sounds of a deer picking its way through the forest. These were heavy, deliberate, like something massive was moving through the woods. The sound of heavy footsteps followed, not quick like a bear or deer, but slow and methodical. Whatever it was big enough that we could feel slight vibrations in the ground with each step. Steve quickly doused the fire with water, plunging us into near-total darkness. The moon was only a quarter full, and the tree canopy blocked most of that light. We all instinctively crouched down, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. Rocky was still growling, but now it was more of a whimper. Mark had his hand firmly on the dog's collar to keep him from running off. I fumbled for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Some primal instinct told me that would be a bad idea. That's when the smell hit us. I've been around dead animals before. I've smelled roadkill in summer heat, but this was different. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky I can't even describe. The odor was so strong it made my eyes water. Through the gaps in the trees, we could see something moving. The darkness and fog made it hard to make out details, but what I saw will stay with me forever. It was a massive shadow, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, moving with an eerily smooth gait between the trees. The shoulders were impossibly broad, and it was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The way it moved was wrong. Too fluid for something that size, yet unmistakably bipedal. It stopped about 30 yards from our camp, just stood there, watching. I could feel its eyes on us, though I couldn't see them. The silence was absolute except for Rocky's whimpering and our own breathing, which we were all trying desperately to control. I remember thinking my heartbeat was so loud it must be able to hear it. For what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, it just observed us. Then it made a sound that turned my blood to ice, a long, low vocalization that started as a deep rumble and rose to something between a whoop and a howl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before or since. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a wolf, wasn't anything I could rationalize. Then it moved, not away from us, but towards us. 2 massive steps in our direction. Steve let out an involuntary gasp and I nearly wet myself. I could see its outline more clearly now. The massive head that seemed to sit directly on those huge shoulders, the long arms that hung down past its knees. The fog seemed to swirl around it, making it look almost ghostly. Just when I thought it was going to charge us, something happened that probably saved us from whatever it was planning. Far off in the distance, probably from the main campground, we heard a car alarm start blaring. The creature's head snapped in that direction, and without any warning, it turned and moved away from our camp toward the river. The speed with which it disappeared was terrifying. Something that large shouldn't be able to move that quietly or that quickly. We stayed frozen in place for at least another hour, none of us daring to move or speak. Rocky had stopped growling but was shaking like a leaf. When we finally got up the courage to move, we huddled in Steve's tent, the largest one, with our backs to each other, watching all directions until dawn. None of us slept. As soon as it was light enough, we investigated the area where we'd seen the creature. The ground was soft from recent rain, and what we found made my stomach drop. There were footprints, massive ones, at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were deeply pressed into the mud, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 6 feet apart. We tried to take pictures with Mark's digital camera, but in the early morning light and with the cheap camera, they came out too blurry to make out any detail. We also found broken branches on some of the trees at a height of about 8 feet, way too high for any normal animal. Some of the breaks looked fresh, with sap still oozing out. The weird thing was, these breaks weren't random. They seemed to form a rough line, like whatever made them was marking its territory. We packed up our camp in record time and got out of there. The drive home was almost completely silent. What do you say after something like that? We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe it was some kind of mass hallucination brought on by bad beer. But we all knew what we saw wasn't normal. I've never been back to Mohan State Park, and as far as I know, neither have any of the others. We don't talk about that night much, even among ourselves. When we do get together, though, there's always this unspoken understanding between us. We know what we saw, even if we can't explain it. Looking back, what strikes me most isn't just the size or appearance of whatever we encountered, but the intelligence behind it, the way it moved, the way it observed us, the way it seemed to be assessing the situation. There was nothing animalistic about it. This wasn't some mindless beast wandering through the woods. This thing was thinking, calculating, deciding. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in the area since then. Turns out there have been quite a few sightings around Mohican over the years, though most people keep quiet about them. I understand why. Who wants to be known as the crazy person who claims they saw Bigfoot? But I know what I saw. We all do. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still hear that sound it made, that deep, resonating call that seemed to echo through the trees. I still feel those vibrations in the ground from its footsteps, and I still wonder what would have happened if that car alarm hadn't gone off when it did. I'm sharing this now because I finally realized that keeping it bottled up doesn't make it any less real. That night changed how I view the world and what I think is possible. There are things out there we don't understand, things that defy our rational explanations. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I know how it sounds. But I know what I experienced, and I know 3 other guys who would tell you the same story, detail for detail. The woods at night hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets have a way of revealing themselves when you least expect it. Just be careful out there, especially around Mohican. And if you're camping and everything suddenly goes quiet, maybe pack up and leave. That's what I wish we had done. I've kept this story mostly to myself for almost 20 years now, but I need to share what happened to my family during that summer of 2005 in Maine. Maybe writing this will help me make sense of it, though I doubt it. I was 37 at the time, and my husband Tom and I had decided to take our kids, Sarah 12 and Mike 9, to our summer house near Rangeley, Maine. We'd owned the place for about 5 years, but hadn't visited in the last 2 due to work commitments. The house sits on about 3 acres, backed up against dense forest that stretches for miles. It's pretty isolated. The nearest neighbor is about half a mile down the dirt road, and the closest town is a good 25-minute drive. We'd always loved that seclusion, until that week. We arrived around 2 p.m. on a Sunday in late June. Everything seemed normal at first. The grass was overgrown, and some branches had fallen in the yard during the previous winter, but nothing unusual for a house that had been empty for 2 years. Tom went to check the generator while I started unloading the car. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There were these deep scratches on the wooden siding near the back door, about 7 feet up. They weren't like anything I'd seen before. 4 parallel lines, each about an inch deep into the wood. I called Tom over, and he suggested it might have been a bear, though he looked troubled. We'd had bears around before, but these marks seemed different. They were too high up, even for a bear standing on its hind legs. As I walked around the house checking for any other damage, I found massive footprints in the soft soil near the tree line. They were partially eroded by rain, but you could still make out the basic shape, easily 15 inches long. I'm not a tracker or anything, but I knew these weren't from any normal wildlife. They were too big for a bear, and the shape was almost human-like, but huge. We tried to keep things normal for the kids. We unpacked, cleaned up the house, and had dinner. But I kept finding myself staring out the windows at the tree line. The forest had never bothered me before, but something felt different now, wrong, somehow. That first night around 11 p.m. we heard it. The kids were asleep upstairs, and Tom and I were watching an old movie on our portable DVD player when there was this knocking. Not like someone politely knocking on a door, it was more like something solid hitting the side of the house. 3 distinct knocks, pause, then 3 more. Tom muted the movie, and we just sat there listening. The knocking moved around the house from one wall to another. Then came the footsteps, heavy footsteps, circling the house. Whatever it was big. We could feel slight vibrations in the floorboards. Tom grabbed his flashlight and the old rifle we kept in the house. I begged him not to go out there, but he insisted he needed to check. I watched from the window as he walked around the house. The beam of his flashlight swept across the yard and into the trees. Then I heard him yell, not in fear, more like surprise, and the flashlight beam jerked upward. There was movement in the trees, something large shifting in the darkness, and then silence. Tom came back inside looking like he'd seen a ghost. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely lock the door. I asked him what he saw, but he just shook his head and said we should go to bed. That was so unlike him. Tom's always been the rational one, always ready with a logical explanation, but he wouldn't talk about it, just kept saying we should try to get some sleep. The next few nights followed the same pattern. As soon as it got dark, the knocking would start. Sometimes it would be accompanied by this awful smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, so strong it seemed to seep through the walls. The kids were terrified. We tried telling them it was just the wind or animals, but they knew something was wrong. Sarah said she could see eyes reflecting in the darkness, watching her window at night. What really got to me were the mornings. Each day we'd find new evidence, more footprints, deeper this time. Branches broken off trees at impossible heights. We're talking 12, 15 feet up. Once we found what looked like a crude shelter made of broken branches and leaves about 50 yards into the woods. Tom dismantled it immediately, but his hands were shaking the whole time. By Wednesday night, I couldn't take it anymore. The knocking had started earlier than usual, right at sunset. We were all in the living room, trying to pretend everything was normal, when we heard this sound, this deep, rumbling vocalization that was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite human. It was somewhere in between, and it went on for what felt like minutes. That's when I saw it. I was staring out the window, and there was just enough daylight left to make out a shape at the edge of the trees. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, broad shoulders, covered in dark hair or fur. The details are burned into my memory, the way it moved, so fluid for something so large, the way its head turned to look directly at the house. But what I remember most clearly were its eyes. They caught the last bit of sunlight and seemed to glow with this reddish-orange tint. Those eyes held intelligence. This wasn't just some animal. It stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just watching. Then it took one step forward, into slightly better light, and I could see its full size. The muscles under that hair, the massive hands, the way it carried itself, almost human but not quite. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like those eyes were looking right through me. Then Sarah screamed. She'd seen it too. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and in one fluid motion it turned and disappeared into the forest. The way it moved, no bear or person could move that fast through dense woods in failing light. But it did. We left the next morning, didn't even pack properly, just threw essential stuff in bags and got out of there. Tom called a realtor from the car and listed the house. We sold it 2 months later, well below market value, just to be rid of it. The new owners apparently haven't reported anything unusual, but we've never gone back to check. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that week. Tom still won't talk about what he saw that first night, but he wakes up sometimes, covered in sweat, muttering about eyes in the darkness. Sarah had nightmares for months. Mike threw away his Bigfoot books and refuses to go camping. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I know. If someone had told me this story in 2004, I would have thought they were making it up or had watched too many horror movies. But this happened. That thing was real. Whatever it was intelligent enough to stay just out of clear sight most of the time, smart enough to intimidate us without actually attacking, and patient enough to wear us down night after night. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching other families from the tree line, knocking on walls in the dark. I wonder if the new owners have found strange footprints or heard impossible sounds in the night. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. I try not to think about those eyes, or the way it moved, or the intelligence behind its actions. The rational part of my mind wants to explain it away. Stress, imagination, tricks of light and shadow. But then I remember those footprints, those scratches high on the wall, that awful smell, and those eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. Some things can't be explained away. Some things you just have to accept as real, even if they don't fit into your understanding of what's possible. I've never written this down before, and I probably never will again. But it happened. Every word of it happened. And somewhere in the woods of Maine, something is still out there. Something that watches and waits and knocks in the night. I was driving home from my late shift at the nursing home in Greenville. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was taking State Route 502, this narrow country road that winds through cornfields and patches of woods. Anyone who knows that area understands how pitch black it gets out there. The corn had already been harvested, leaving those empty fields looking even more desolate under the quarter moon. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, but something felt different that night. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and there was this weird ground fog hovering just above the road. My headlights were cutting through it, creating these eerie shapes that kept catching my attention. About 3 miles from my house, just past the old Miller farm where the road curves sharply right, my headlights swept across something that made my heart stop. Between 2 large oak trees at the field's edge, maybe 40 feet from the road, I saw these eyes reflecting back at me. At first I thought it was a deer. We get tons of them out here, but these eyes were too high off the ground, way too high. I instinctively took my foot off the gas, slowing from about 45 to maybe 25 miles per hour. That's when I noticed the outline. Whatever it was massive. I'd guess at least 7 feet tall. The eyes were set in this face that was... God, it's hard to even describe it. It was like a human face, but not quite. The forehead was more pronounced, and the jaw was different, more robust. The thing that really got me was how it was standing, not on 4 legs like a bear, but upright, perfectly upright, like a person. Its arms hung down past its knees, and even in the dim light, I could see it was covered in this thick, matted hair. The color looked medium brown, but it's hard to be certain in those conditions. When I slowed down, it moved, not away from me like an animal would, but toward the road. Its gait was smooth but powerful, covering ground faster than any person could. That's when the smell hit me, even inside my closed car with the heat running. It was this overwhelming musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. Pure instinct kicked in. I slammed on the gas, and my little Honda Civic lurched forward. In my rearview mirror, I saw it actually running alongside my car. This thing had to be moving at least 35 to 40 miles per hour, keeping pace with me for several seconds. Its arms swung with this unnatural precision, and its head remained perfectly level while running. Then, as suddenly as it started, it just stopped. Just planted its feet, and stood there in the middle of the road, watching my taillights disappear into the darkness. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheels straight. I made it home in record time, bursting through the door and probably scaring the hell out of my husband Mark, who was half asleep on the couch. When I told him what happened, he laughed it off, saying I probably saw a bear. But I've seen bears. This wasn't a bear. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes reflecting in my headlights, the way it moved. That's what keeps coming back to me. No animal moves like that. The next morning, I called my friend Rachel, who's always been interested in this kind of stuff. She came over, and we drove back out there around 10 a.m. The ground was still damp from the dew, and there they were, footprints in the soft earth by the roadside. They were huge, maybe 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. We could see 5 distinct toes on each print. They led from where I first spotted it, across the road, and into the woods on the other side. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 5, 6 feet apart. We followed the tracks about 50 feet into the woods before they disappeared into the rocky ground. Rachel took photos, but they don't do justice to what we saw. The depth of the prints in the mud suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Later that day, I looked up other sightings in Darke County. Turns out, there have been several reports over the years, especially around the wooded areas between Greenville and New Madison. Some locals call it the Route 502 Walker. Most people treat these stories as jokes or local legends, but I know what I saw. I've since changed my route home from work. It adds an extra 15 minutes to my drive, but I refuse to take 502 after dark anymore. My husband thinks I'm being ridiculous, but he wasn't there. He didn't see how it moved, how it looked at me with those eyes that seemed to hold intelligence behind them. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about what would have happened if I hadn't accelerated when I did. The thing that really disturbs me is that it seemed to be waiting there, right at that curve in the road, like it knew that cars have to slow down at that spot. I still work the late shift, but now I carry a high-powered flashlight in my car, and I never drive with my windows down at night, even in summer. I know how crazy this all sounds. If someone had told me this story a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But when you see something like that with your own eyes, something that shouldn't exist but clearly does, it changes you. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to explain it away. A bear walking upright, a person in a costume, though no costume could move like that. Or maybe my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then I remember those footprints in the mud the next morning, and I know what I saw was real. I've never reported this officially. Who would I even report it to? The local police would probably think I was crazy or attention-seeking. Besides, I have nothing to prove it except those photos of the footprints, which Rachel still has saved somewhere. But I know what I saw that night, and I know I'm not the only one who's seen something out there in Dark County after dark. To this day, I still get an overwhelming sense of dread whenever I drive past that spot, even in broad daylight. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes again. They say once you see something like this, you start noticing things you never did before, like how the woods seem to go quiet sometimes for no reason, or how sometimes you get that feeling of being watched when you're alone outside. I don't know what it was that I saw that night. I'm not claiming it was definitely a Bigfoot or anything else specific. All I know is that it was real, it was massive, and it moved in a way that defied everything I know about local wildlife. Whatever it was, it made me realize that maybe we don't know as much about our world as we think we do. I've never shared this story publicly before, but what happened to me and my buddy Mark back in '89 still haunts me to this day. I was 19 at the time, living in New Philadelphia, Ohio, just a short drive from Gnadenhutten. We were both into collecting antiques and old farm equipment. You could find some really cool stuff in abandoned properties back then. It was mid-October, probably around the 15th or 16th. The weather had been unusually warm for that time of year, hitting the mid-60s during the day, but cooling off significantly as evening approached. We'd heard about this old Amish farm that had been abandoned since the early 70s, sitting at the end of Miller Road NE, about 2 miles off Route 36. Mark and I arrived at the property around 4:30 p.m. The sun was still up but starting to get low, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields. The place was exactly what you'd expect from a farm that had been sitting empty for almost 20 years. Tall grass everywhere, rusted farm equipment scattered about, and this massive weathered barn that was somehow still standing. The main farmhouse had practically collapsed in on itself, but that barn, it was built solid, probably from the 1800s, with those huge hand-hewn beams you don't see anymore. We parked my '85 Chevy pickup about 50 yards from the barn, partly because the grass was too high to drive closer, and partly because neither of us wanted to risk getting stuck out there. The property was so isolated, nothing but dense woods on 3 sides and overgrown cornfields on the 4th. The nearest neighbor had to be at least a mile away. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, nothing. At the time I figured it was just because of the season, but looking back now, something wasn't right from the moment we got there. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and can tell someone's been there recently, even though you can't see them? It was like that, but stronger. We had our usual gear, flashlights, work gloves, and my Polaroid camera. Mark brought his backpack to carry anything small we might find. The barn doors were partially open, enough for us to squeeze through without having to force them wider. The interior was dim but not completely dark, thanks to the gaps between the wooden slats and a few broken windows near the roof. The ground floor was pretty much what we expected. Old stalls, some rusted tools, rotting hay. We'd been in dozens of barns like this before, so we knew the good stuff would be up in the hayloft. The ladder to the second floor looked sturdy enough, so Mark went up first while I held it steady. That's when I noticed the smell. If you've ever been around farms, you know all the usual smells: hay, manure, mold. This was different. It was this heavy, musky odor, almost like wet dog, but much stronger, and with this, I don't know how to describe it, this wild undertone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The hayloft was huge, running the entire length of the barn. Sunlight streamed in through the gaps in the walls, creating these dusty beams of light that made it easier to see. We found some cool stuff right away: old horse tack, some hand-forged tools, even a box of mason jars with original blue glass. Mark was particularly excited about an old grinding wheel he found. We'd been up there maybe 20 minutes when everything changed. First, it got really quiet. Even the sound of our footsteps on the wooden floor seemed muffled. Then we heard it, this deep, heavy breathing coming from somewhere below us, not like a cow or a horse. This was different. It was deliberate, controlled, almost like whatever was making the sound was trying to smell us. Mark and I froze. The breathing got louder, and then we heard something that I'll never forget, the sound of claws or nails slowly scraping across the wooden floor below, not like a dog's nails clicking on hardwood. These were slow, deliberate scratches that sent chills down my spine. I remember looking at Mark, and his face had gone completely white. We both slowly moved toward the edge of the loft, where we could look down through a gap between the floorboards. What I saw, I still have trouble processing it all these years later. Standing near the barn entrance was something massive. The sunlight coming through the door was behind it, so I couldn't make out all the details, but what I could see was enough. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders and powerful arms that hung down past its knees. The thing was covered in dark, matted fur that looked almost reddish-brown where the light hit it. But it was the way it moved that really got to me. It wasn't like a bear or any other animal I'd ever seen. There was an intelligence to its movements. It turned its head slowly, deliberately, scanning the barn. When it lifted its head toward the hayloft, I could see its face in profile. It had this pronounced brow ridge and a flattened nose, almost human-like but definitely not human. We stayed absolutely still, barely breathing. The creature took a few steps forward, and each footfall made the floorboards creak under its weight. The scratching sound we'd heard earlier, it was running its fingers along the support beams as it moved. I could see its hands clearly now, massive things with what looked like thick, dark nails or claws. The smell was overwhelming at this point. That musky, wild odor was so strong it made my eyes water. We watched as it moved deeper into the barn, always keeping its head slightly tilted like it was listening. It stopped directly beneath us. I don't know how long we stayed there, frozen in place. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, without warning, it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between, and quickly moved back toward the entrance. The speed with which it moved was terrifying. Something that big shouldn't be able to move that fast. We heard it exit the barn, and then nothing. Complete silence again. Mark and I stayed absolutely still for what must have been another 10 minutes, neither of us daring to move or speak. Finally, I whispered that we needed to get out of there. We abandoned everything we'd found and moved as quietly as we could toward the ladder. Getting down was the scariest part. Each time the ladder creaked under our weight, I was sure the thing would come rushing back. When my feet hit the ground floor, I nearly threw up from the adrenaline. The smell was still heavy in the air, and we could see fresh scratches in the wooden beams, deep gouges that no normal animal could have made. We didn't run right away. That was probably the hardest part. Everything in me wanted to sprint for the truck, but we forced ourselves to move slowly, scanning in all directions as we made our way out of the barn. Only when we were about halfway to the truck did we hear something in the woods to our right, branches breaking under heavy weight. And that's when we ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. We practically dove into the truck, and I had the engine started before my door was even fully closed. As I turned the truck around, I caught a glimpse of movement at the tree line, something large and dark moving between the trees, but I didn't stop to get a better look. The drive home was a blur. We didn't talk much, just kept checking the rearview mirrors. Mark threw up as soon as we got back to my place. We tried to talk about what we'd seen, but neither of us could really put it into words. What do you say after something like that? I know what people will think reading this, that we saw a bear, that our minds played tricks on us, that we were just scared kids letting our imaginations run wild. But I know what I saw. That thing in the barn wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before or since. The intelligence in its movements, the way it seemed to be studying us. There was something almost human about it, but at the same time completely wild. I've never gone back to that property, and as far as I know, neither has Mark. We don't talk about it much anymore, but every October, one of us will usually call the other, and we'll just sit in silence for a while on the phone. We don't need to say anything. We both know what we're thinking about. I still have nightmares sometimes about those moments in the hayloft, watching that thing move below us. But what really haunts me is the thought that it knew exactly where we were the whole time. It wasn't hunting us or trying to scare us. It was studying us just as much as we were studying it. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if somewhere out in those woods It still remembers us too. I've been hunting in the Clearwater National Forest in Idaho for over 25 years. But what happened last October changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. I'm still trying to make sense of it, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever go back to that particular area again. It was October 12th, during elk season. I'd taken a week off work and driven up to my usual hunting grounds, about 30 miles northeast of Orofino. The weather was typical for that time of year, overcast, temperatures in the low 40s, with a light drizzle that had been going on and off all morning. I'd parked my truck at one of the Forest Service roads and hiked about 4 miles in, wearing my usual gear, warm camo, my trusted Remington 700, and enough supplies for a 3-day solo hunt. Around 2 p.m., I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. In a muddy clearing, I found a set of footprints that made my blood run cold. Now, I've tracked everything from elk to grizzlies in these woods, but these prints were different. They were human-like, but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was incredible, probably around 4, 5 feet apart. The mud was still wet from the morning rain, and the prints looked fresh, maybe a few hours old at most. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, but I was deep in the backcountry. Nobody lugs fake feet this far into the wilderness just to make prints. Plus, the depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I took some photos with my phone, even put my boot next to one for scale. My size 11 boot looked like a child's footprint in comparison. Being an experienced hunter, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow the tracks, thinking maybe there was a logical explanation. The prints led deeper into the forest, following a game trail that I knew eventually connected to Orofino Creek. As I tracked, I noticed broken branches high up on the trees, way higher than a bear could reach. Some were snapped clean off at around 8, 9 feet high. The weather started turning as the afternoon wore on. The clouds got thicker, and that light drizzle turned into a steady rain. The forest felt different too. Usually you hear squirrels, birds, the usual forest sounds, but everything was quiet. Too quiet. You know that feeling when you're being watched? Every hunter knows it. It's what keeps you alive sometimes. Well, that feeling was overwhelming. Around 6 p.m., with daylight fading, I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It started as a low moan that built into something between a scream and a howl. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't any animal I've ever heard in 25 years of hunting. It sounded almost human, but not quite. The sound echoed through the trees, and I swear I could feel it in my chest. It came from somewhere ahead of me, maybe 300 yards away. My hands were shaking as I checked my rifle. I've faced down black bears before, even had a close call with a grizzly once. But this was different. This felt wrong. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but I was at least 3 hours from my truck, and darkness was coming fast. I decided to make camp in a small clearing backed against some large rocks. It wasn't ideal, but it gave me some protection and a clear view of the approach. I got my tent up quick, gathered some firewood, and tried to settle in for the night. The rain had stopped, but the woods were still dead quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps. Not the quick steps of a deer or elk, but slow, deliberate footsteps that made the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever it was circling my camp. Then came that sound again, a deep, resonant growl-like breathing. Not aggressive, but definitely not anything I'd heard before. It was close, maybe 50 feet from my tent. I lay there, gripping my rifle, barely breathing. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes they'd stop, and I'd hear wood knocking against wood, like someone hitting a tree with a stick. Then more footsteps, more of that deep breathing. Just before dawn, I heard something that made my heart stop. A series of vocalizations, not screams this time, but what sounded like deep, guttural words. I can't explain it better than that. It wasn't English, wasn't any language I know, but it had structure, rhythm. It sounded like communication. When the first light of dawn came, everything went quiet. I waited another hour before unzipping my tent. The ground around my campsite was torn up with those same massive footprints, now pressed deep into the rain-soaked soil. There were broken branches scattered around, and about 70 feet from my tent, I found a pine tree with bark stripped off at about 8 feet high, with what looked like bite marks in the wood. I didn't wait around. I packed up as fast as I could and got out of there. The walk back to my truck was the longest 3 hours of my life. I felt eyes on me the whole way, but I never saw anything. Just more of those footprints, broken branches, and that oppressive silence. I've been back to the Clearwater since then, but never to that specific area. The photos I took of the footprints came out blurry. Of course they did. But I know what I heard that night. I know what was stalking around my camp. I've talked to other hunters who've had similar experiences in those woods, but most won't talk about it publicly. They're afraid people will think they're crazy or lying. I'm not claiming I saw Bigfoot. I never actually saw anything. But whatever was out there that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. It was intelligent, it was huge, and it wanted me to know it was there. Maybe that's what scares me the most. It could have easily gotten to me in that tent, but it didn't. It was studying me, just like I'd been tracking it. The Clearwater National Forest is over 1.8 million acres of wilderness. We think we know what's out there, but maybe we don't know as much as we think. I'm still processing what happened that night, still trying to make sense of it. But one thing's for sure. Those woods hold secrets, and sometimes they let you get just close enough to realize how little we really understand about what's out there. As a field researcher specializing in wetland ecosystems, I've spent countless hours in remote locations. But nothing in my scientific training could have prepared me for what happened at Granite Lake in northwestern Montana back in May 2021. I was conducting a seasonal assessment of amphibian populations and aquatic vegetation patterns at a series of high-altitude lakes. This particular site was about 15 miles from the nearest access road, deep in the Cabinet Mountains wilderness. It was a relatively clear spring day, temperature around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with patchy clouds, perfect conditions for field work. That morning started like any other field day. I arrived at my designated survey point at 7:30 a.m., having hiked in with my standard gear, water testing equipment, specimen collection containers, my tablet for data entry, and camping supplies since I was planning to stay 3 nights to complete the survey. The lake itself is fairly small, maybe 800 feet across at its widest point, surrounded by dense lodgepole pine and western red cedar. There's a steep ridge on the northern side that creates this natural amphitheater effect. I spent the early morning taking water samples and documenting shoreline vegetation. Around 10:45 a.m., I noticed something odd. The constant background chorus of birds just stopped. Anyone who works in the wilderness knows that sudden silence usually means something's up. I initially thought it might be a mountain lion or bear, which isn't unusual for the area. I grabbed my bear spray and did a quick scan of my surroundings. That's when I noticed movement on the opposite shore, probably about 600 feet away. At first I only caught glimpses through the vegetation, something large moving behind the trees. I assumed it was a moose, which we occasionally encounter during surveys. But then it stepped partially into view, and I felt my heart literally stop for a moment. What emerged was clearly bipedal and massive. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, except for the face, which appeared darker, almost black. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. The arms were incredibly long, hanging almost to its knees, and it had this distinctive pointed head shape, almost like a sagittal crest. The thing that still haunts me was how it moved. Despite its size, it was incredibly fluid and silent. No crashing through brush like a bear or moose would make. It just glided between the trees. But what really got to me was its behavior. It was watching me. Not just in the way animals sometimes look at humans before running away. This thing was actively studying me. It stood partially concealed behind a large cedar, perfectly still, just observing. I'm trained to take field notes of everything I observe, so despite my trembling hands, I started documenting details. Looking back, I think this was my way of coping with fear, falling back on scientific training. The creature's hair wasn't uniform in color. It had these subtle variations, darker around the shoulders and lighter on the limbs. Its muscles were clearly visible even through the hair, especially around the shoulders and arms. The face was flatter than a bear's, with a pronounced brow ridge. This standoff lasted maybe 45 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then something crashed in the forest behind me, probably a startled deer, and I instinctively turned toward the sound. When I looked back, the creature was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I'd love to say I packed up and left immediately, but I had thousands of dollars worth of research equipment with me, and my vehicle was hours away. So I did what any terrified but responsible researcher would do. I consolidated my sampling equipment and moved to what I hoped was a more secure position, closer to the lake's outlet stream, where I had better visibility. The rest of the day was psychological torture. You know that feeling when you're absolutely certain you're being watched? Multiply that by 1,000. Every shadow in the trees looked like a massive figure. Every snapping twig sent my heart racing. I tried to continue my work, but I was operating on pure autopilot, constantly scanning the tree line. Around 4:30 p.m., I found the first footprint. It was in a muddy area near where I'd moved my gear. A massive impression, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between prints was enormous, over 6 feet. I took photos and used my sample collection ruler for scale. I still have these photos, but honestly haven't looked at them in months. They make me too uneasy. As dusk approached, things got worse. I started hearing wood knocks. Not like woodpeckers, but like someone hitting trees with heavy branches. They seemed to be coming from different directions, as if there was more than one source. There was also this smell that kept coming and going with the wind, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but more pungent. I had set up my tent, but there was no way I was sleeping there. I spent the night with my back against a large boulder, headlamp and bear spray at ready. Around 2 a.m., I heard heavy breathing and bipedal footsteps circling my position, staying just outside my light's range. Sometimes branches would snap, but it was the deliberate way they broke, slow and controlled, not like something accidentally stepping on them. At first light, I found 3 trees near my campsite with huge claw marks about 8 feet up. Not like bear scratches. These were deliberate parallel lines, almost like markers. There were also branches snapped off at heights I couldn't reach, and they weren't broken downward like from wind or snow load. They were broken upward and twisted off. I packed up and left as soon as there was enough light to navigate safely. The whole hike out, I kept hearing movement parallel to my trail, just out of sight in the dense forest. It followed me for at least 2 miles before the sounds finally stopped. I filed my field report, but left out most of these details, only noting that unsafe wildlife conditions had forced an early evacuation. What was I supposed to say? That Bigfoot kicked me out of my research site? I'd have lost all credibility in my field. The most frustrating part is the physical evidence I did gather. The photos of the footprints and claw marks doesn't even come close to conveying the overwhelming wrongness of what I experienced. Photos can't capture the feeling of being stalked by something that shouldn't exist, something that moved with an intelligence that felt almost human, but clearly wasn't. I've been back to Montana many times since then for work, but I've never returned to Granite Lake. I've requested reassignment of any survey sites in that area. My colleagues probably think I had a bad bear encounter, and I'm content to let them believe that. But I know what I saw. Those eyes watching me from behind that cedar. They weren't the eyes of any known animal. There was something ancient and aware in that gaze, something that fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. The incident has affected my work habits. I no longer do solo surveys in remote locations, always requesting a partner or adjusting my research methods to stay closer to access points. I've become hypersensitive to sudden silences in the forest, and the sound of wood knocking still makes my skin crawl. What bothers me most isn't the possibility that Bigfoot exists. It's the certainty that it does, and the knowledge that there's no way to convey this truth without sounding crazy. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, data, and peer review. But how do you quantify an experience that challenges everything you've been taught about North American wildlife? How do you maintain your professional reputation while arguing for the existence of something that shouldn't exist? Sometimes I wonder if it was testing me that day, assessing whether I was a threat. The calculated way it revealed itself. The strategic intimidation throughout the night. It all seemed too purposeful to be simple animal behavior. But that line of thinking leads to questions I'm not ready to confront about what else might be out there, living in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to believe. What happened to me at Mill Creek Park in Youngstown back in October 1998 completely changed how I view nature, and honestly, I still get uneasy thinking about it. It was October 14th, a Wednesday afternoon. I remember the date clearly because it was my day off, and I'd been doing these midweek hikes at Mill Creek for about 3 years at that point. The weather was unusually warm for October in Ohio, probably around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with this heavy, damp feeling in the air that made everything smell more intense. You know that earthy autumn smell when leaves are decomposing? The sky was overcast, creating this weird, diffused light through the trees. I'd parked at the West Bobcats Trail parking lot around 4:30 p.m. Yeah, it was getting late, but I'd done this trail dozens of times and figured I had about 2 hours of decent light left. The parking lot was empty, except for my Honda Civic and an old pickup truck, which wasn't unusual for a weekday. The first mile was completely normal. I was walking at my usual pace, taking in the fall colors, and occasionally stopping to check out interesting fungi or plants. It was something I always did on these walks. The trail was wet from rain the previous night, and my boots were making that satisfying squishing sound on the damp leaves. That's when things started getting weird. I noticed the birds had stopped chirping. You know that sudden silence that feels wrong? At first, I thought maybe a hawk was nearby. That usually shuts the smaller birds up, but this silence felt different, heavier somehow. My skin started prickling, and I got that feeling you get when someone's watching you. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle, and that's when I heard it. Branches snapping behind me, maybe 50 yards back. Not like a squirrel or deer moving through the brush, but heavy breaks, like something big was stepping on substantial branches. I turned around slowly, trying to act casual, and that's when I saw it. Between 2 large oak trees, about 150 feet behind me, stood something that my brain couldn't quite process. It was tall, way taller than any person I've ever seen. I'm 6'1", and this thing had at least 2 feet on me, maybe more. It was covered in dark brown hair, almost black, but not uniform in color, kind of patchy in places. The build was massive, with broad shoulders that seemed to slope up to a somewhat conical head. There was no distinct neck that I could see. Here's the part that still gives me chills. It was standing completely still, just watching me. Not in an aggressive way, but with this intense curiosity that felt almost methodical. I could see its chest moving as it breathed, and its arms, God, those arms were long, hung at its sides. I didn't run. Everything in my body was screaming to run, but I remembered reading somewhere that running from predators is usually the worst thing you can do. So I just started walking again, trying to keep my pace steady despite my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I could hear my blood rushing in my ears. Every few steps I'd stop, pretending to look at something on the ground or in the trees. And every single time I stopped, I could hear it stop too. When I walked, it walked. When I stopped, it stopped. This went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 10 minutes. The trail curved to the right up ahead, and I lost sight of it momentarily. When I looked back again, it was gone. The silence remained, but now it was punctuated by distant wood knocks, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree, but deeper, more resonant. I picked up my pace a bit, still trying not to run, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, in the mud of the trail, were footprints, massive footprints. They were at least 16 inches long with 5 distinct toes pressed deep into the soil. The stride length between them was huge, easily twice what mine would be. They were fresh. Water was still seeping into the depressions. I took out my flip phone to try and take a picture, but in my shaking hands, all I got were blurry, useless images. Plus, the light was getting worse by the minute as dusk approached. I knew I needed to get back to my car. The return trip was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept hearing movement in the woods parallel to the trail, breaking branches, rustling leaves, and occasionally what sounded like heavy breathing. At one point, I heard what I can only describe as a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the creature's chest. It wasn't aggressive, more like a sound of communication or curiosity, but it made the hair on my neck stand up nonetheless. When I finally reached the parking lot, the pickup truck was gone. I was fumbling with my car keys when I had this overwhelming urge to look back at the tree line. There it was, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree about 100 yards away. Even at that distance, I could see its massive frame, and what really got me, what I'll never forget, was how it was gripping the tree with one hand, almost like a child hiding behind their parent's leg while watching something interesting. The creature's face was mostly shadowed, but I could make out its eyes reflecting what little light was left in the day. They weren't glowing or anything Hollywood-like, just a dull reflection, like when you catch a deer in your headlights but smaller and more focused. It was still just watching. I got in my car, started it, and drove away as calmly as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw it step fully out from behind the tree, standing in the open, following my car with its gaze until I turned the corner. That was 26 years ago, and I've never gone back to that specific trail. I still hike at Mill Creek Park, but only on the popular trails, only during peak hours, and never alone. I've heard other stories from the area over the years, other encounters, strange sounds, unexplained tree structures, but I've kept my experience to myself until now. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw. Could it have been a person in a suit? The height, the movements, the way it breathed. No suit could replicate that. A bear? We don't have grizzlies in Ohio, and black bears don't walk upright for that long or move the way this thing did. Every logical explanation I've come up with falls apart when I remember the details. Sometimes I drive past the park entrance on my way to work, and I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching other hikers from behind the trees, following them with that same curious intensity. I wonder if others have seen it too, but like me, have been too afraid of ridicule to come forward. I don't need anyone to believe me. Honestly, if someone told me this story, I'm not sure I would believe them either. But I know what I saw that day. It was real, it was intelligent, and it changed everything I thought I knew about what exists in our forests. This happened back in 2002, when I was 23. I used to go night fishing all the time with my buddies Mike and Dave at Silver Lake. It's pretty remote, about 30 minutes outside of Hillsboro, Ohio. We knew every inch of that lake, or at least we thought we did. We'd been fishing there since high school, usually 2-3 times a week during summer. The lake itself isn't huge, maybe half a mile across at its widest point, surrounded by dense forest. There's an old dirt access road that leads to a small clearing where you can park, but otherwise it's pretty isolated. That night started like any other fishing trip. We arrived around 8:30 p.m. on a Wednesday in late August. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, almost full moon, and that slight chill in the air that hints at fall coming. We had our usual spot on the eastern shore where we'd cleared a small area for our chairs and gear. The lake was like glass that night, barely a ripple. Looking back, maybe that should have been our first clue that something was off. We got set up quickly since we'd done it hundreds of times before. 3 folding chairs, our tackle boxes, a small cooler, and our battery-powered lantern. I remember checking my watch at 9:15 p.m. when I cast my first line. The frogs were really going at it, making that constant background noise they always do. Crickets, too. Normal night sounds. Around 10:30 p.m., we'd caught a couple of decent-sized bass, nothing spectacular. Dave was telling some stupid story about his new job when we heard it, branches breaking on the other side of the lake. Not unusual in itself. We'd seen plenty of deer over the years, but this was different. The sound was more deliberate, slower, heavier. Then everything went quiet. And I mean everything. The frogs, crickets, even the light breeze in the trees, all just stopped. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. I remember getting this weird pressure in my ears, like when you're up in the mountains. Mike whispered, "You guys hear that?" We all nodded, eyes fixed on the opposite shore. The moon was bright enough that we could see the tree line pretty clearly, maybe 200 yards across the water. That's when we saw movement. At first it was just shadows shifting between the trees, but then, God, I still get chills thinking about it. This figure emerged from the tree line. In the moonlight we could see it was massive, Way too big to be a person. I'm 6'1" and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. The proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, reaching almost to its knees, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. We all froze. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved. The creature walked, strode, on 2 legs to the water's edge. Its movements were smooth, almost graceful despite its size. It wasn't stumbling around like someone in a costume would. This was natural, fluid, like it belonged there. The thing that really gets me, what I still see in my nightmares, is how it moved at the water's edge. It wasn't acting like an animal. It crouched down, and I swear to God it started examining the water, like it was studying it. Its hands, and they were hands, not paws, were huge. It dipped them in the water, creating these gentle ripples that we could see spreading across the lake's surface in the moonlight. I remember gripping my fishing rod so tight my knuckles were white. Dave had his hand over his mouth. Mike was trembling. We were all thinking the same thing. Our truck was parked about 50 yards behind us. If this thing decided to come around the lake. The creature stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5, 10 minutes, just touching the water, looking at it. Sometimes it would lift its head and seem to scan the lake. Did it know we were there? I think it must have. But it never looked directly at us. Then something changed. A distant car engine echoed through the trees, probably someone on Route 50, miles away. The creature's head snapped up. Its movements became more alert, more animal-like. Without any rush, it stood up to its full height. Even from across the lake, its size was impossible. It turned and walked back into the tree line, not running, not hurrying, just purposeful steps, until the darkness swallowed it. We waited. The forest was still dead quiet. After about 30 minutes, Mike whispered, "We need to get the fuck out of here." Nobody argued. We grabbed our gear as quietly as possible, leaving some stuff behind in our hurry. I remember the sound of our reels clicking as we wound in our line seemed deafening in that silence. The walk back to the truck was the longest 50 yards of my life. Every snap of a twig under our feet made my heart stop. We kept looking over our shoulders, expecting to see that figure emerging from the trees. When we finally got to the truck, Dave's hands were shaking so bad he dropped the keys. The engine starting seemed as loud as a jet taking off. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd all seen it. We all knew what we'd seen wasn't possible, but we'd seen it. The next morning, we went back. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to ourselves we'd imagined it. The lake looked normal in the daylight, but when we went to the opposite shore, where the creature had been, there were marks in the mud, handprints, massive handprints, twice the size of mine, with distinct fingers, and footprints, partially obscured but clearly visible, 16 inches long at least, with 5 toes. We took pictures with Dave's disposable camera, but when we got them developed, they came out too blurry to make anything out clearly. That was the last time I went night fishing at Silver Lake. I've been back during the day a few times, always with a group, but never at night. Never alone. Mike still fishes there sometimes, says nothing's happened since. Dave moved to Cincinnati the following year. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I know. If someone told me this story, I'd think they were full of shit. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just shadows and an overactive imagination. But then I remember the absolute silence of the forest, the deliberate way it moved, those hands in the water, and I know what I saw. The weird thing is, it never felt threatening. It never made any aggressive moves toward us. It was just there, doing its own thing. But that almost makes it worse, because it means these things are out there, going about their business, while we're all pretending they don't exist. I still fish, but I stick to populated lakes now, well-lit areas, places where the trees don't grow right up to the water's edge, places where I can tell myself that the shadows moving between the trees are just shadows. But sometimes, when I'm near any body of water at night, I catch myself scanning the opposite shore, watching for movement, listening for that absolute silence that comes before something impossible happens. One last thing. I never reported this officially. Who would I even tell? The local police would think I was crazy or drunk. But I know there are others out there who've seen similar things, maybe even at Silver Lake. If you have, I'd like to hear about it. Not to prove anything. I know what I saw. but because maybe you also need someone to tell you you're not crazy, that the world is bigger and stranger than we want to admit, and that sometimes, on quiet nights by still waters, impossible things happen. This happened in late August 2015, during what was supposed to be a week-long survival expedition in Yukon Territory. I was part of a group of 4, myself, my friend Ben from college, his cousin Mark, who was an experienced outdoorsman, and Sarah, who I'd met through a wilderness training course earlier that year. We'd planned this trip for months, specifically choosing the Pelly Mountains region, about 40 miles southeast of Ross River. The area is incredibly remote, which was exactly what we were looking for. We wanted to test our survival skills in actual wilderness, not some tourist-friendly campground. Mark had done similar expeditions before and helped us plan everything meticulously. The first 2 days were exactly what we expected, challenging but rewarding. We'd hiked deep into the territory, set up temporary camps each night, practiced our navigation skills, and foraged for edibles to supplement our packed supplies. The weather was decent for Yukon that time of year, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and dropping to the mid-30s at night. We'd seen plenty of wildlife, mostly caribou in the distance, some ptarmigan and signs of moose, but nothing concerning. That third day started normally enough. We'd found a good spot to make camp near a small stream, with decent tree coverage, but still open enough to keep good visibility. The location was perfect, elevated slightly with a clear view of the surrounding area, about 200 yards from the stream. We'd learned enough about wilderness safety to know you don't want to camp right next to water sources where animals frequently travel. We got our camp set up well before sunset, around 6 p.m. In late August up there, you still get decent light until quite late, but the darkness comes on pretty quick when it does hit. We had our fire going, had finished eating some dehydrated meals supplemented with some berries we'd gathered, and were just sitting around talking about the day's hike. That's when things started getting weird. I remember checking my watch. It was 9:47 p.m., still with a bit of twilight left. The first thing that hit us was the smell. I've been around plenty of dead animals and raw sewage in my life, but this was different. It was this overwhelming mixture of wet rot and something musky, like a skunk but worse. Sarah actually gagged a bit when it first hit us. The strange thing was how suddenly it came on. 1 minute we were fine, the next this wall of stench just enveloped our camp. Mark immediately got more alert. I remember him sitting up straighter and scanning the tree line. He'd mentioned earlier that sudden smell changes usually mean large predators. Then the woods went quiet. If you've spent time in the wilderness, you know it's never actually silent at night. There's always some ambient noise, insects, small animals, wind in the trees. But everything just stopped. The only sound was our fire crackling. That's when we heard it. From somewhere in the darkness came this sound that I still have trouble describing. It wasn't quite a growl, more like a deep rumbling breath, but impossibly loud. It seemed to come from something much larger than a bear. Ben later said it reminded him of the sound a horse makes when it snorts, but amplified many times over. Sarah was the first one to see it. She was facing the northern edge of our camp, and I saw her face just go completely white. She barely whispered, "There's something out there." I turned to look where she was staring, and that's when I saw it too. Just at the edge of where our firelight reached, maybe 40 yards out, there was this massive dark figure. The trees in that area were pretty mature, probably 30, 40 feet tall, and whatever this thing was, its shoulders came up to at least 8 feet. It was just standing there, partially hidden behind a trunk, but clearly visible enough to see its outline. The thing that struck me most was how it stood, perfectly upright, like a human, but impossibly large. Mark very slowly reached for his rifle. We had it for emergency bear protection. The moment he moved, this thing made another one of those breathing sounds, and I swear I could feel it in my chest, like when you're standing too close to a bass speaker. Then it just stepped back into the darkness. No crashing through the brush, no running away. It moved almost silently, which seems impossible for something that size. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, taking turns keeping watch. Nobody slept. The smell lingered for hours. Occasionally, we'd hear heavy footsteps circling our camp, just far enough out in the darkness that we couldn't see anything. A few times we heard wood knocking sounds, like someone hitting a tree with a heavy stick, coming from different directions. When dawn finally came, we immediately started looking around the camp. That's when we found the tracks. They were everywhere around the perimeter of our camp, always just beyond where our firelight would have reached. These weren't bear tracks. I've seen plenty of those. These were huge, easily 16 inches long and clearly foot-shaped, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between them was massive, at least 6 feet apart. But the thing that really shook us was finding one of our food bags missing. We'd hung them properly in trees about 100 yards from camp, at least 12 feet high. Whatever took it had to be tall enough to reach up and grab it. The rope wasn't broken. It had been untied. The knot we used wasn't anything complex, but it required opposing thumb movement to undo. We packed up camp in record time. Nobody wanted to say what we were all thinking. We practically jogged the whole way back, making what should have been a 2-day return journey in just under 11 hours. We only stopped twice for water and basic orientation. When we finally got back to civilization, we tried to rationalize what happened. Bears don't untie knots. Moose don't walk on 2 legs. No known animal makes those sounds or moves that quietly for its size. We made a pact not to talk about it. Who would believe us anyway? This is the first time I've written about it in detail. I still go camping and hiking, but never in that region again. Sometimes when I'm in the woods at night and things get quiet, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive shape standing there. The most unsettling part isn't what we saw. It's knowing that whatever it was intelligent enough to deliberately stay just outside our light, smart enough to untie our food bags, and patient enough to spend hours circling our camp. I've tried researching similar encounters in that area since then. There are a few scattered reports from locals and other hikers, but nothing gets officially documented. The indigenous peoples of that region have stories about giant beings in the mountains that go back generations, but most people dismiss them as legends. I know what we experienced that night was real. The fear, the smell, those footprints. You don't imagine details like that. Sometimes I wonder if it was as curious about us as we were terrified of it. Whatever it was, it could have easily attacked us if it wanted to, but it didn't. It just watched and waited like it was studying us. The 4 of us still keep in touch, but we rarely talk about that night. When we do, it's usually after a few drinks, and even then, we dance around the details. Mark stopped doing solo expeditions after that. Sarah got really into researching cryptozoology, but won't go camping anymore. Ben threw himself into trying to find scientific explanations for what we saw, but eventually gave up. I've never gone public with this story before because I know how it sounds. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I just know what we experienced, and I know that there are things in the wilderness that we don't understand. If you're planning a trip to the Pelly Mountains, stick to the marked trails and established campgrounds, and if you're out there and suddenly notice that the forest has gone quiet, maybe it's time to pack up and head back.